Hey guys, tonight we're taking you past the velvet ropes and into the places you are absolutely never supposed to see. The royal palaces of history weren't just about coronations and garden parties. They were, at their core, epicenters of power, desire and manipulation, where every moan and whisper behind gilded doors had consequences that could ripple through entire empires. And if you're here hoping for some steamy historical drama, well, buckle up. Because we're not just talking about candlelit romances and forbidden kisses. We're talking about sex as a political act, lust as leverage, and bedchambers as war rooms. You're about to see just how dark and disturbingly strategic desire could be when royal bloodlines were at stake. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Not emotionally, at least. The level of creepy obsession, bizarre rituals, and downright manipulation behind royal bedroom doors. It's a little much, like cancel your Disney Plus subscription levels of disillusionment. But before we get too deep in, do me a favour. Take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Seriously, no pressure. Also, drop your city and what time it is in the comments. I love seeing how far we travel together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in Versailles tonight. The year is 1682, and you're definitely not wearing jeans. No, you're in an itchy, perfumed, layered outfit that smells like lavender and sweat, because deodorant hasn't been invented yet. You've just arrived at the glittering heart of Louis XIV's court, a place where the chandeliers drip with crystal. The floors are polished so fiercely you can see your powdered face in them, and every wall is covered in mirrors. Not for vanity, but surveillance. The Sun King doesn't miss a thing. It's easy to get distracted by the luxury, gold leaf furniture, embroidered pillows, silks from the Orient, but you notice pretty quickly that behind all the courtly chatter and ceremonial bows, something more primal simmers underneath. This is a place obsessed with appearances, yes, but more than that, it's obsessed with who's sleeping with whom, and it's not a secret. The affairs, the flirtations, even the more sordid trysts, they're not hidden so much as performed. Louis XIV himself sets the tone. His long reign is practically sponsored by lust. He has an official mistress, Madame de Montespan, who lives in a suite just down the hall from the Queen. He also has an unofficial mistress, a string of temporary ones, and quite possibly a few entertainments among the palace dancers and actresses. And then there's the Queen, poor Maria Theresa, who everyone mostly ignores unless she's popping out another child. And here's the twist. It's not just tolerated, it's political theatre. To be chosen as the king's mistress is like being knighted, with orgasms. You're given titles, estates, and influence. You can get your brother promoted to general just by sighing in the right tone at the right time. It's that serious. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, literally, are the courtiers. Hundreds of nobles stuffed into chambers, all vying for power. The competition is brutal. You start to notice that people flirt constantly but never casually. Every brush of a sleeve, every sly glance, every smirk carries layers of meaning. It's strategic seduction. You hear a baron whisper about bedding a duchess just to win favour with her powerful uncle. You catch a glimpse of a countess slipping into a guard's quarters. It's all part of the game. One quirky little fact. The king's morning routine is public. It's called the lever, the rising. Courtiers crowd into his bedroom to watch him get out of bed, be washed and dressed, like he's a living doll. It's bizarrely ceremonial and intimate, and no one finds this odd, because the closer you are to the king's skin, the closer you are to power. Historians still debate just how much of this palace-wide sex economy was accepted versus endured. Some argue it was empowering for women like Madame de Pompadour, who used their charm and intelligence to wield influence in male-dominated spaces. Others say it was just another gilded cage, where women's value was reduced to their ability to please the king and bear children. No easy answers here, just lots of powdered faces and trapped people playing a dangerous game. You wander the halls and hear muffled laughter behind one of the many secret doors. Versailles is full of hidden passages, some connecting lovers, others used for spying. A tapestry flutters ever so slightly. Someone just slipped through. You follow, heart pounding, not out of curiosity, out of survival. Because in a place like this, where sex equals status and desire is weaponized, You either play the game or you get destroyed by it. Oh, and you're being watched. Always. Servants, guards, chambermaids, they see everything. That moment when a duchess lingers too long in the king's study, noted. That midnight hallway rendezvous, whispers fly by morning. Gossip is currency, and your reputation can shift in a single evening. This isn't a palace, it's a hive. Everyone's buzzing, manoeuvring, trying to sting someone else just lightly enough to survive the blowback. And sex, whether real, rumoured or arranged, is the honey that keeps them coming back. By the end of the night you start to feel a little nauseous. Not from the wine or the perfume, but from the performance of it all. It's exhausting. There's no privacy. There's no real love. Just alliances and transactions cloaked in velvet and musk. And the king? He's tired too. But tomorrow he'll rise again in front of his crowd, and his mistress will hold court while the queen watches from behind her fan. And somewhere, in a small side room, another seduction will begin. Because this is Versailles, and nothing, not even sex, is ever just personal. The wedding was magnificent, of course. Every royal wedding is. But once the final toast is drunk and the powdered wigs are taken off, the real ceremony begins, and it doesn't involve priests or diamonds. You're in a palace somewhere in Central Europe now, maybe Habsburg territory, and tonight is the night everyone has been waiting for with bated breath and grossly inappropriate curiosity. The consummation. You're not just in the room metaphorically. No, you're there, literally. Because in many royal courts, the witnessing of the consummation wasn't just a creepy custom, it was a legal necessity. The newlyweds, usually teenagers, are led to bed by an entire group of advisors, relatives, clergy, and court watchers. Some of them pray, some of them smirk, a few of them take notes. The couple is expected to climb into bed, touch enough to satisfy the crowd, and then, mercifully, be left alone to finish the job. Or not. Because if the sheets come up dry in the morning, it could mean annulment, scandal, or worse, war. You sit in the corner of the room and watch the bride shift nervously. She's maybe 15 and terrified. Her husband is a stranger, older, and equally unsure of himself. The room smells like rosewater and anticipation. Someone coughs awkwardly. A bishop mutters a blessing. The Queen Mother leans forward for a better view. Welcome to the horrifying tradition of public consummation, where proving the marriage wasn't just about family honour, but about alliances between kingdoms. And before you ask, yes, there were virginity tests too, conducted by midwives, court physicians, and sometimes, horrifyingly, political rivals. A young royal woman might be subjected to an inspection to confirm her purity before marriage, because in a world obsessed with lineage, the idea that a woman might already be used was cause for alarm, even treason. If she failed, a planned marriage could be cancelled, and her value as a bride plummeted. Some were sent to convents, others were quietly discarded from court life like expired fruit. But here's where things get especially absurd. Virginity didn't even mean the same thing everywhere. In France, a hymen was the gold standard. In Spain, behaviour mattered more. Was she shy enough? Demure? In England, the whispers mattered more than the proof. There are stories of women practising bleeding tricks, or having maids smuggle in pre-soaked sheets to make the morning look successful. Some even paid doctors to repair the damage. In short, the whole system was a mixture of folklore, fear, and phony science. Tonight's bride is lucky, or unlucky depending on how you look at it, because after the public has retreated, she's left with a man she's never spoken to privately. There's no passion here, just duty. Her body isn't hers, it belongs to the crown, and her womb, that's a political battlefield. Quirky fact for you, some courts would weigh the bride before and after her wedding night. Why? To detect proof of deflowering. Don't ask about the logic, it doesn't exist. This was the era of powdered wigs and bloodletting. Sanity was optional. There's still an ongoing scholarly debate about how often these consummation rituals were actually enforced. Some historians believe the full public scene was rare, more myth than standard. Others argue that for high-stakes political marriages, especially those between powerful houses like the Habsburgs, Bourbons or Tudors, These moments were absolutely staged, and sometimes even recorded in court documents. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, real for some, exaggerated for others, but always looming. As you tiptoe back out into the candlelit corridor past guards and scurrying servants, you realise something uncomfortable. This wasn't about sex. It never was. It was about surveillance, ownership, control. The act itself could be clumsy, sad, or even avoided entirely, but what mattered was the illusion, the performance of purity, the assumption of fertility. The palace, after all, is an engine. Its fuel, heirs, and there's no room for mechanical failure. A queen who doesn't get pregnant fast enough becomes suspect. Whispers swirl. Maybe she's barren, maybe she's cursed, maybe she's frigid. Doesn't matter. The pressure builds. Midwives offer tinctures. Priests offer prayers. The king starts looking elsewhere. And soon, the court is already speculating about who will replace her. And then there's the cruelty of it all. When a childless royal woman finally does conceive, her body becomes public property. Her diet is controlled. Her staff is replaced. In France, they built a special birthing room where up to 200 people might watch a queen give birth. Live. No pressure, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight, somewhere behind you, a door creaks shut. A guard resumes his post, and two young people lie in a massive cold bed, trying to fall asleep while the expectations of entire nations press down on them like lead. You walk back down the hallway, where portraits of ancestors glare down at you. Kings who ruled for 50 years, queens who died in childbirth. And somewhere, painted more delicately, a young woman who passed her virginity test and was praised for it, until she failed to bear a son. Nothing here is what it seems, and just as you're about to turn in for the night, you hear it. The creak of floorboards, the soft thump of someone running down a side corridor. You peek around the corner and catch a glimpse of a lady in waiting slipping into a nobleman's chamber. No audience, no expectations, just a choice, a quiet rebellion. In this place, that's rarer than gold. There's no such thing as privacy in a royal palace, not really. But for a few, very particular women, privacy isn't just granted, it's gilded. You're standing outside a set of double doors that don't look like much, just carved wood and understated trim, but behind them lies a world most of the court would kill to enter. This is the private apartment of the royal mistress, and unlike the queens, these women choose when to open their doors and when to slam them shut. You step inside and are immediately hit by the scent of vanilla, sandalwood, and something just slightly spicy. Probably a custom blend from North Africa. The tapestries are new, the cushions plump, and a harp leans artfully in the corner, even though no one here actually plays it. Welcome to the lair of the favourite, a title not granted lightly. This woman doesn't just share the king's bed, she shares his ear, his confidence, and sometimes even his power. Take Madame de Pompadour, for example. She started as a bourgeois beauty with ambition sharper than any court dagger. Through charm, wit, and an absolutely ruthless understanding of court dynamics, she became the official mistress of Louis XV, not just tolerated, but adored. She hosted salons, advised on policy, and shaped the culture of an entire reign. And fun fact, after their physical relationship cooled, she stayed on as the king's emotional confidant, and reportedly recruited other young women for him to sleep with. That's not a typo. Imagine HR, but make it Versailles. The concept of an official mistress sounds like something out of a trashy novel, but in royal circles it was practically a job title. In some cases, she even got her own budget line in the state accounts. Land, jewels, servants, titles. These weren't gifts of affection, they were compensation. Because being a royal mistress was exhausting, dangerous work. Don't think it was all love letters and stolen kisses. Every other noblewoman at court wanted that position, and they'd do anything to get it. Spies lurked everywhere. Maids who reported to rivals, musicians who watched who entered and exited whose rooms. And as soon as a mistress started to lose favour, too old, too opinionated, too infertile, the vultures circled. There was also no guarantee of protection. One day, you're curled up with the king in a private garden reading poetry. The next, you're exiled, penniless, and whispered about as if you were diseased. Power through proximity is a risky gamble. And if you happen to get pregnant, oh boy, if it's a son you might be elevated. If it's a daughter, maybe a quiet retirement. But if the king denies it, you're just another scandal with a bastard to hide. Right now you're watching the current favourite of your particular king, let's call her Isabel, sit in front of a vanity while her maid brushes out her hair. She's not especially young, nor traditionally beautiful, but when she looks at you, there's something impossible to ignore in her gaze. Confidence, calculation. She knows the stakes. She knows her days are numbered. But for now, she rules this tiny kingdom of silk and sighs. You overhear her giving instructions to the maid. A duke is visiting. He wants to pay his respects, which is court speak for seeing if Isabel still has the king's attention. If she does, the duke will flatter her. If she doesn't, he'll pretend not to see her at all. That's the social death of a mistress, when the greetings get colder than the marble floors. Of course, some royal lovers wielded their power more, physically. Take Barbara Villiers, one of Charles II's infamous mistresses. She was so dominant at court that even the Queen had to pretend to like her. Or Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, technically a queen, but treated like a mistress, whose past and allegedly present sexual escapades led to her beheading. The line between mistress and martyr is thin and usually written by men. There's an ongoing historical debate about how much real influence these women had. Were they policy shapers, or just well-dressed distractions? Some scholars argue that mistresses were scapegoats, used to absorb blame for royal misbehaviour. Others insist they were powerful political figures in their own right, wielding soft power through conversation, mood and pillow talk. Either way, they left their mark, not just on the king's sheets but on history. You step back into the hallway and notice something. The Queen's chambers are quieter. Fewer visitors, fewer servants, and no perfume in the air. She has the title, but not the attention. In contrast, Isabel's suite is a hive of activity. Gifts arriving, letters being composed, musicians rehearsing softly in the next room. It's a bizarre reality. The Queen may wear the crown, but the mistress commands the room. And it's not just in Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, royal concubines held immense power, sometimes rising to become the Valide Sultan, mother of the Sultan and effective ruler of the empire. In China, imperial consorts lived in isolated compounds, governed by a strict hierarchy, but those at the top could manipulate politics from behind silk screens. Across cultures, the idea repeats: access to the royal body means access to the royal will. But it's a dangerous game. Behind every smile is suspicion. Behind every gift, a bribe. Isabel knows this. She finishes her wine, rises slowly, and gestures for her cloak. She's going to the king now. Whether to plead, to argue, or to seduce, you're not sure. But whatever happens behind those doors will ripple out into the entire court by morning. And you? You just witnessed the quiet power behind the throne. The woman without a crown, but with everything else. You wake up to the clanging of bells, not from alarm but ceremony. Today a royal couple has returned from their honeymoon. Code for, we waited just long enough to make sure no one's visibly limping from all the awkward first-time sex. And now comes the strange, almost theatrical ritual the court's been buzzing about for days. It's time for the bedding ceremony, a half-public, half-private tradition that blurs the line between religious rite, softcore entertainment, and royal reality TV. You follow the slow, winding trail of courtiers into the royal bedchamber. There's incense, there's clapping. Someone's playing a lute in the corner with way too much enthusiasm. The couple, dressed in ceremonial nightclothes, red, not subtle at all, are escorted to bed by a procession of nobles. Yes, nobles. Their closest friends and family members are literally tucking them in, arranging the sheets, fluffing pillows, and then toasting to the couple's future fertility. Nothing says a romantic evening like your uncle offering fertility advice while adjusting your mattress. And here's the kicker, this isn't a weird outlier. Bedding ceremonies like this were standard practice across much of Europe. In Tudor England, for example, the royal bed was treated like an extension of the throne. Witnesses weren't just making sure the couple was cosy, they were verifying in a deeply disturbing way that the marriage was physically legitimate. Without that consummation, a wedding wasn't considered fully valid. That's right. A king and queen could be married by the archbishop himself, but if they didn't go full steam ahead in the sheets, the alliance could still fall apart. There's a famous case that practically defines this absurdity: Mary Tudor and Philip II of Spain. Their union was so politically loaded that people waited for days to hear proof of consummation. And when rumours started that Philip had underperformed, or not performed at all, it nearly caused a diplomatic crisis. Imagine being a teenage bride and the future of your nation depends on whether your new husband could get it together in bed. No pressure. Back in the room, the couple now lies awkwardly under the covers. The guests are slowly filing out, still chatting, still sipping from ornate goblets. One elderly countess even tosses a small sprig of rosemary onto the bed, an old superstition for virility. You hang back a moment longer and glance at the bride's face. She's smiling, but it doesn't reach her eyes. It's the expression of someone who knows she's not in control of what happens next, but still has to pretend it's all perfectly fine. Later you learn that this whole ritual will be written down. Official court scribes record everything: the time the couple entered the room, the witnesses present, the temperature of the room, sometimes even the behaviour of the couple the following morning. It's not just creepy, it's statecraft. That document becomes part of the historical record, used to defend claims, justify annulments, or validate children's rights to inherit. You start to realise how much of royal sex wasn't about sex at all. It was surveillance, it was symbolism, it was ceremony. There's this myth that medieval and early modern royals lived wildly indulgent, passion-fueled lives, but the truth is their most intimate moments were planned, observed, and weaponised. You didn't get to make love, you performed duty. And if you didn't do it convincingly enough, well, good luck explaining yourself to the Privy Council. You duck down a narrow hallway and end up in the servants' corridor. It smells like old stone and damp wool, and the contrast to the royal quarters is brutal. This is where the actual gossip lives. The chambermaids talk in hushed voices as they swap linens, and one of them giggles as she holds up a set of newly stained bedsheets. This, she says, will go straight to the Queen Mother. Not because she's weird, but because she's the one who certifies that the marriage was, shall we say, fruitful. There's a long-standing scholarly debate over how much of this was real versus ritual. Did anyone actually expect to witness the act itself? Was the proof ever fabricated for political convenience? Some argue the entire process was symbolic, a kind of sacred performance meant to reassure the court that everything was in order. Others insist it was sometimes very literal. Either way, the pressure was real. Entire foreign policy decisions hinged on what happened, or didn't, between those sheets. And of course, this wasn't limited to heterosexual marriages. In cases where queens married kings with, let's say, different preferences, the ceremony still had to happen. There are accounts of frustrated kings performing under duress, queens quietly sobbing into their pillows, and everyone else pretending none of it was deeply traumatic. The point wasn't emotional connection, it was optics. You finally step back out into the grand hallway, where the chandeliers sparkle and the nobles return to their card games and passive-aggressive gossip. The tension from earlier is already fading. The ceremony's done, the sheets are collected, and the rumours are flying. Did he seem enthusiastic? Was she trembling? I heard the Duchess say she blushed all night. Every detail becomes currency, and the couple. No one really cares how they're feeling. As far as the court's concerned, they've done their duty, or faked it well enough to count. Back in your own guest quarters, you pull the heavy curtains shut and lie on the stiff feather mattress, staring up at the ornately carved ceiling. You think about all the royal couples before, strangers turned into symbols, thrown into bed with expectations heavier than their crowns. And you wonder, quietly, if any of them ever really fell in love, or if they just learned to fake it until their heirs were born and their usefulness expired. Tomorrow there'll be more ceremonies, more whispers, more arrangements. But tonight, someone somewhere is being tucked into bed by their kingdom. Somewhere behind the scent of beeswax polish and dried rose petals, past the grand bedchambers and sweeping marble halls, lies the less romantic side of the palace, the service wings. You find yourself walking along a narrower corridor now, the stone colder, the air thicker. The silk and satin are gone. In their place, linen shifts, scuffed boots, and the hum of whispered secrets. Welcome to the world of palace servants, the unseen gears of royal life, and the ones most entangled in its dirtiest little scandals. Here, in the shadows of the throne, love, or lust, has no etiquette guide. Chambermaids and stable hands, cooks and valets, they live close enough to royalty to breathe the same air, yet distant enough to be invisible. But desire, it doesn't care about rank. And in these tight quarters, it slinks around like candle smoke, curling between glances and brushed hands in the laundry rooms. You stop outside the laundry chamber where steam rises from a giant copper basin. Two maids are bent over a pile of damp linens, chatting in hushed tones about someone, probably a noble, who's taken a liking to the new scullery boy. One of them snorts. He won't last the week. Not because he's bad at his job, but because someone important has noticed his face, or maybe his muscles, or maybe just that he walks like he hasn't been broken yet. Servants, especially young ones, are vulnerable prey in a palace. It's not that abuse is officially sanctioned, it's that it's easier to ignore. When a duchess borrows her maid for the night and returns her silent and shaken, no one reports it. When a footman is summoned to a royal chamber after hours, he's expected to obey, not ask questions. The code is simple. Your body belongs to the hierarchy. Refuse, and your references disappear. Comply, and maybe, just maybe, you rise a little higher in the system. And yet, among the shadows, real affection also sparks. Lovers meet under stairwells, behind tapestries, between shifts. A gardener courts a maid with pilfered tulips. A cook slips extra pastries to a tired kitchen girl. Quiet, unsanctioned romances that flicker for a time before someone is reassigned, dismissed, or caught. Because in the palace, love between servants is dangerous. Not because it's immoral, but because it's inconvenient. If a maid gets pregnant, it's a logistical nightmare. If two male servants are found together, it could mean exile, or worse. You overhear a curious story about a footman who once fell for a lady in waiting. He carved her name into the inside of a wardrobe door and waited months just to touch her hand in the hallway. When they were discovered, he was beaten and dismissed. She was married off to a distant cousin in the countryside. But the wardrobe's still here, tucked in an unused room. If you press your ear to the wood, some say you can hear the name still whispering. There's a quirky historical case that's been passed around like folklore. In one northern court, the Queen's hairdresser, an unassuming man with an exceptional talent for tight curls, ended up being the secret lover of 3 different nobles. When the intrigue came to light, the court didn't punish him. Instead, they promoted him. Why? Because he now had leverage. He knew things. Valuable things. In this strange world, sleeping your way to power wasn't just a metaphor. It was a resume. Servants also became the palace's eyes and ears. They saw everything. They knew who was creeping down which hallway and at what hour. They knew what noises came from which rooms, which royal wore perfume to bed, and which foreign ambassador was secretly slipping coins to the page boys. And sometimes they talked. Gossip in a royal court is more than sport. It's survival. A well-placed rumour can destroy a rival or protect a friend. Historians still debate just how much influence palace servants wielded. Some argue they were pawns, used and discarded. Others suggest they were the hidden players behind many royal decisions. Confidants, lovers, spies, and saboteurs all rolled into one. And if you look at enough royal scandals, you'll find servant fingerprints on almost all of them. Who else would have the opportunity? Who else would know? In the Ottoman court, eunuchs, castrated men often of African origin, were tasked with guarding the harem. But they didn't just guard, they governed. The chief black eunuch, for instance, had enormous political power and was often closer to the sultan than any vizier. In other courts, trusted servants acted as intermediaries for secret affairs, carrying letters, unlocking doors, covering for trysts. You might call it loyalty, or perhaps just survival instinct dressed up as discretion. You step into one of the servant quarters, barely wide enough for a narrow cot and a wooden chest. A young woman is folding sheets, and as she sees you, she nods with a weariness that speaks volumes. Her hands are red from the laundry, her eyes sharp. She's heard things, seen things Things she'll never speak of out loud, unless of course she needs to. And that's the constant equation here. What do you know, and who wants to know it? A maid who walks in on a royal rendezvous has two choices: keep it buried or leverage it. A stable boy who spots a nobleman sneaking from another man's chamber might be paid to forget, or paid more to remember. Outside, the palace bells chime again, marking the start of the afternoon court. Nobles sweep by in embroidered coats and elaborate wigs, barely glancing at the ones who hold their trains and clean their sheets. But underneath those silks and jewels, it's the servants who know where the bodies are buried, sometimes literally. And tonight, as the candles flicker low and the nobles retreat to their beds, some of those same servants will slip through the corridors once more, some to clean, some to deliver messages, some to return to places they never should have left, and some to love, if only for a little while. The walls are thin here. Not physically, of course. They're made of stone and centuries of secrets, but you start to realize that in a royal palace, privacy is an illusion. Even the grandest chambers are laced with hidden doors, whispering keyholes and cleverly disguised peepholes carved into ornate woodwork. And tonight, you're going to follow a different path, not the one lined with polished marble or ceremonial carpets, but the quiet, forbidden corridors where desire slinks under candlelight and love can cost a head. It's late, and the palace is exhaling after another day of titles, toasts, and tiresome politics. You should be in bed. Most are, but you're not. You're gliding barefoot down a narrow hallway lit only by the flicker of a single torch. The guards have already changed shifts. The nobles are too drunk to notice you, and you're not the only one awake. Somewhere above you, a heavy door clicks shut, followed by the unmistakable patter of slippers on old wood. A window creaks open, then a pause, then two rapid knocks, a signal. You press yourself against the stone wall and listen. Another set of footsteps, lighter this time, faster, someone sneaking in. Through the servants' entrance? No, a side passage, hidden in plain sight. Royal palaces are like organisms, beautiful, yes, but filled with ducts, passageways, and secret tunnels connecting everything to everything else. Not because they wanted romantic midnight escapades, though that too, but because the palace was also a surveillance network. Kings needed to move without being seen. Guards needed to patrol discreetly. Lovers? Well, they made good use of the design. Tonight the hallway leads you to an older part of the palace. Less marble, more stone, more dust. This wing was once used by a dowager queen who died childless and bitter, or so the maids say. You round the corner and nearly trip over a cloak dropped hastily on the floor. You know that smell, clove, citrus and sandalwood. Someone important just passed through. You peek into the chamber. There, silhouetted by moonlight, are two people, a royal nobleman and someone you don't recognise. A maid? No. Her clothing's too fine for a servant, but too plain for court. Ah, a lady in waiting. Dangerous territory. She's high enough to matter and low enough to ruin. Their lips are locked, their bodies tangled. The man's shirt is halfway off. She's laughing, softly, like she can't believe they're doing this. And they shouldn't be. He's married, likely to someone with a coat of arms etched into every goblet in the dining hall. She's unmarried, but if this gets out, she never will be. Worse, if she ends up pregnant, the child will be branded a bastard, and her name will vanish from the official records faster than a candle in a draft. But for now, none of that matters. Not the politics, not the titles, just skin on skin and the thrill of not getting caught. Forbidden love has always found its way into palaces, not because royals are more romantic than the rest of us, but because the stakes are higher. When you're expected to marry for power, not passion, everything real has to happen in secret. So secret, in fact, that some monarchs built entire rooms for it. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but delicious all the same, about an 18th century Polish king who had a trapdoor under his bedroom rug. Supposedly, it led down to a velvet-lined chamber where he entertained lovers of all genders, away from spying ministers and suspicious bishops. He called it his evening parliament. But of course, not every love story ends in velvet. Some end in blood. Anne Boleyn, for instance, may or may not have cheated on Henry VIII. Historians still argue about it, but whether or not it was true didn't matter. The suspicion alone was enough to sentence her to death. One minute she's queen, the next she's kneeling on the scaffold, her hair tucked under a linen cap. That's the thing about forbidden love in a palace. It's rarely punished with exile. It's punished with execution. You slip out before the couple notices you and make your way back through the corridor, heart racing. Every corner you pass seems like it's watching. Every crack in the wall feels like a witness. You wonder how many other forbidden trysts have played out along these same paths. How many lovers met here, trembling, knowing they were gambling everything for a night that might be their last. And it wasn't always about lust. Sometimes it was love, real love, the kind that's worth risking a crown for. There's the story of Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria and Baroness Mary Vetsera. They died together in a hunting lodge, likely a suicide pact driven by the impossibility of their love. He was already married. She was deemed inappropriate. So instead of facing a lifetime of duty without affection, they chose the final escape. Scholars still debate their motivations. Was it love? Madness? Political pressure? We'll never know. What we do know is that they wrote letters, lots of them, pages and pages of desperate devotion, tucked between pillowcases and sewn into hems. Because in a palace, even the written word had to be hidden. You finally reach your room, pulse still pounding. You lie back on the stiff mattress and stare at the ceiling, but sleep doesn't come. All you can think of are the footsteps, the whispers, the creaking doors. Somewhere above you, someone is still in someone else's bed, and somewhere else, someone is already planning what to do when the secret comes to light. Because in a palace, every hidden affair is a ticking clock, and when it strikes, someone always pays the price. The first thing you notice about the palace's eastern wing is how utterly different it feels. Gone are the perfumed tapestries and flirtatious glances of the European courts. The air here is heavier, more incense than perfume, more shadows than mirrors. You've entered a world of whispers and watchful eyes. In this part of the world, the royal harem isn't just a place. It's a system, a hierarchy, a fortress. And within its walls, sexuality is both sacred and surveilled, tightly controlled by an elite class of men who cannot participate in it at all. The eunuchs. You walk slowly past towering lattice screens that let in shafts of sunlight, but reveal nothing of what's behind them. Female laughter echoes in the distance, soft and fleeting, like a breeze that vanishes the moment you try to feel it. The harem, particularly in the Ottoman Empire or Ming Dynasty palaces, isn't some Orientalist fever dream of silk cushions and seductive dancers. It's a rigidly structured, politically charged space. The women here are not lounging, they're manoeuvring, training, waiting, competing. They are royal concubines, servants, and in some cases literal prisoners, taken from conquered lands or purchased as tributes. But many will become powerful, some even surpassing queens in influence, and every moment of their existence is observed by the eunuchs, castrated male servants placed in charge of guarding the harem. Ironically, in being stripped of their sexual function, eunuchs were given enormous political access. You meet one of them in the hallway dressed in flowing dark robes, a long beaded cord in his hand. He's not deferential. He doesn't bow. In fact, he walks with the authority of someone who knows too much and fears nothing. This is the chief eunuch, the most powerful man in the palace not wearing a crown. He can grant access to the sultan, or deny it. He handles messages between royal lovers. He can elevate a concubine or make her disappear. There's a strange power dynamic at play. The eunuchs are both insiders and outsiders, present in the most intimate spaces but forever denied participation. This makes them ideal gatekeepers, or dangerous enemies. Historians argue about the psychological impact of this role. Some eunuchs rose to immense power. One in China became so influential, he manipulated the emperor and managed the entire bureaucracy. Others lived in bitter frustration, wielding control over a world they were permanently exiled from. And there were always rumours that some eunuchs weren't quite as complete as they claimed, or that forbidden encounters still happened under their watch. The truth, lost to the veils of history. You're escorted into the inner chamber of the harem now. A young concubine is singing softly in a dialect you don't understand, her voice like a river at dusk. She's brushing her hair, long and dark and heavy, while another girl oils her arms. They glance at you but don't smile. You're just another pair of eyes, another potential threat. They've been taught that beauty is currency, silence is armour, and affection is always transactional. Despite the romantic legends, concubines weren't just women brought in for pleasure. They were often trained in poetry, politics, music, and espionage. To become a favourite, they had to do more than please the ruler. They had to outwit the others. Rivalries here were brutal. Some poisoned their competition. Others conspired with eunuchs or court officials. Every promotion meant someone else's fall. You overhear a conversation, low, urgent. A concubine is worried she's fallen out of favour. She hasn't been summoned in weeks. Her silk robes have been downgraded. Her meals, smaller. She suspects a new girl is rising. That's how it starts. A glance, a longer visit, a special gift. Before you know it, your status collapses, and the woman who used to serve you now sleeps in the emperor's bed. Quirky fact, in some palaces there were strict rules about eye contact. Concubines could not look directly at the ruler unless summoned. If they did so by accident, they might be punished, or, if the ruler liked the look, promoted. That's right, eye contact was both a crime and a job interview. The entire system seems to oscillate between prison and privilege. Some women here live like queens with jewellery, poetry and influence over state decisions. Others are forgotten, pacing their courtyards like ghosts waiting for summons that never come. Once they age out of favour, they might be retired to quieter estates or, if lucky, married off to loyal bureaucrats. If unlucky, they stay here, symbols of what once was, living relics. You ask one of the eunuchs if any of the concubines ever escaped. He laughs, not kindly. Escape. They're safer here than out there, he says, and in here, at least they matter. You're not sure if that's comforting or deeply tragic. There's a long-standing debate among scholars about the level of autonomy these women had. Some point to queens and mothers of rulers who shaped dynasties from behind the curtain. Others argue that for the majority, life in the harem was gilded captivity, romanticised by outsiders but lived as quiet desperation. Either way, this place is nothing like the fantasy. It's not a brothel, it's not a lounge, it's a chessboard, and every smile is a strategy. As the sun begins to set, the chief eunuch calls for evening prayers. The concubines retreat to their chambers, and the heavy lattice doors close once again. You step back through the corridor, feeling the silence settle like dust. Somewhere deep inside, a young woman stares at a door that may never open for her again. Another one writes a poem she'll never show. And someone, perhaps just now, is being chosen. But for how long? Because in a palace like this, love is not a right. It's a privilege. One that expires the moment someone younger, prettier or more politically useful walks through the door. You're standing in a cabinet and no, this isn't a metaphor. It's an actual royal apothecary cabinet tucked deep in the palace's medical wing, stacked from floor to ceiling with vials, pouches and little wooden drawers labelled in Latin, Persian, and frankly some symbols that look like they were scribbled by a deranged monk on a sugar high. Everything smells like mildew, cinnamon and something faintly rotten. But what you're looking at isn't medicine in the modern sense. No, this is the royal arsenal of aphrodisiacs, a lineup of the weirdest, wildest love potions history ever concocted. The theory is simple, if unscientific. If you can boost a king's libido, you can boost the dynasty. That's the logic. Not, what if he eats better or takes a nap, but what if we grind up a horn, mix it with some wine and see if that keeps the air pipeline moving. You lift a small container marked corn nuoc, which turns out to be powdered deer penis. Excellent. Next to it a jar labelled ambergris, whale vomit technically, but prized for its musky smell and supposed aphrodisiac properties. Then there's Spanish fly, a crushed beetle toxin so potent it could induce fever, hallucinations and in extreme cases death. But hey, what's a little organ failure if the king gets frisky? You hear a story from the palace physician, let's call him Master Albero, about one of the previous monarchs who downed a concoction every morning made of saffron, wine, pepper, and powdered gold. Real gold. Because according to certain alchemical texts, ingesting gold was supposed to invigorate the blood, strengthen the spirit, and more importantly supercharge the royal loins. The king eventually developed tremors and an impressively unpredictable temper, but his mistresses swore he was energetic. This wasn't just superstition. Okay, it was mostly superstition, but it was also desperation. Royal virility wasn't about romance. It was tied to stability, succession, and national pride. A king who couldn't perform wasn't just a private embarrassment. He was a geopolitical liability, which is why entire teams of healers, herbalists, alchemists, and occasionally astrologers devoted themselves to keeping the royal libido in working order. You're ushered into a low-ceilinged room where 3 women are grinding herbs with rhythmic precision. Their faces are pinched with focus, and one of them looks like she hasn't blinked since breakfast. They're preparing a new batch of a popular court favourite, a honeyed paste made of ginger, nutmeg, crushed almonds and rose oil. The idea is to warm the blood, inflame desire, and reduce melancholy, which was code for please just be horny enough to produce an heir. Quirky fact: in Mughal India, emperors were said to keep detailed records of their aphrodisiac intake and sexual activity in coded diaries, which were later burned to avoid scandal. Some of these included bizarre rituals like drinking wine infused with crushed pearls, or bathing in milk mixed with jasmine and saffron before meeting a lover, because nothing says foreplay like full-body dairy. In France, Louis XV's court believed so strongly in the power of aphrodisiacs that his mistresses were fed tonics and teas before being summoned, not for their pleasure, for his. And occasionally, when results were lacking, the blame landed not on the king's age or exhaustion, but on magical interference, which meant someone, usually a rival, was accused of sexual sorcery, arrested, and sometimes even executed. Just imagine being burned at the stake because your boyfriend was having a bad night. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how effective any of these potions were. Modern science gives most of them a firm thumbs down, with the possible exception of ginger and chocolate for circulation, but historians argue that their psychological effect might have been more potent than the ingredients themselves. Belief is powerful, and in a court environment where performance anxiety could lead to a coup, belief was often all a monarch had. You step into the king's private study, where an array of silver flasks lines the windowsill. He's not here, off hunting or napping or maybe whispering in someone else's boudoir, but the scene speaks volumes. Bottles labelled with symbols of Mars and Venus, dried rose petals in sachets, a decanter of dark liquid that smells like cloves and old ambition. The king isn't hoping for romance, he's hoping for vigour, because every failure to perform is a rumour, and every rumour is a crack in the throne. You remember a story told in hushed tones about an emperor who became impotent in his 50s. Rather than admit it, he blamed his concubines, claiming their spiritual contamination was ruining his power. Several were banished, one was executed, and a few more were sent for purification rituals. The emperor then spent months in isolation drinking sun-brewed elixirs and sleeping on sheets soaked in goat's milk. When he returned, he declared himself renewed. Scholars suspect the only thing renewed was his public image. But this isn't limited to men. Queens too were subject to medicinal meddling, especially if they weren't conceiving. Herbal vaginal steams, tinctures to open the womb, and yes, aphrodisiacs tailored to make them more receptive, which really meant more agreeable. There's a story of a 16th century queen who was fed a steady diet of honey-soaked figs and pomegranate wine to encourage submission. She later became notoriously disinterested in everything, except, notably, taking her meals alone. You sit for a moment in the quiet of the apothecary and take in the reality of it all. Every vial, every potion, every dose was another desperate attempt to control the most uncontrollable human function: desire. In the palace, sex wasn't pleasure, it was policy, and libido, like lineage, was just one more thing to be measured, managed, and manipulated. As you leave, one of the herbalists hands you a tiny sachet tied with crimson string. "For energy," she says with a wink. You're not sure if she means physical or political. Honestly, in this place it's always both. And somewhere tonight a monarch will swallow a mouthful of wine laced with powdered tiger bone, lick their lips, and pray that it works. Not for love, not for lust, but for legacy. You wake up to muffled footsteps and the low rumble of wheels on polished stone. Servants are moving fast but quietly, urgent yet careful. Something is happening. Not a feast, not a coronation. Something smaller but infinitely more important. You throw on a robe and slip into the corridor, following the subtle panic radiating from the royal wing. The scent hits you first. Lavender, blood, something acrid like boiled herbs. And then you see the heavy door. Carved, gilded, now partially ajar, guarded by two stone-faced men. Behind it, in that suffocating chamber, a royal baby is being born. The palace is holding its breath. Not in joy, yet, but in suspense. Childbirth is dangerous for everyone, but for a queen. It's an event so loaded with political pressure and public consequence that it barely qualifies as personal. This isn't just a family expanding. This is a dynastic gamble, a womb in play. You hear someone whisper, "Let it be a boy," like it's a spell. Another mutters prayers in Latin. Another begins to pace. Every person in this hallway, from servant to noble, has their future riding on what happens in that room. When you slip inside, carefully, respectfully, invisibly, it's chaos. The room is packed. Midwives scurry like field mice. The royal physician, red-faced and muttering, is doing something awkward with a silver hook. The queen lies in the middle of the bed, propped up, legs bound, drenched in sweat, and flanked by two older women who are holding her hands and muttering words of encouragement. She screams again. Not dainty, not cinematic, raw, animal, and there are witnesses. Always. In France, the tradition was that dozens, even hundreds of people might be present to verify the legitimacy of the birth. Ministers, courtiers, sometimes, horrifyingly, complete strangers. This wasn't about support, it was about proof. Because in a world where impostors could threaten thrones and bastards could spark wars, no royal baby could enter the world unobserved. At the foot of the bed, a court official waits with parchment and ink to record the time of birth. You make out the name of the archbishop. The royal astrologer stands beside him, already calculating what this particular moon might mean for the newborn's fate. You stifle a laugh. The queen is halfway to death, and someone's worried about Mercury being in retrograde. This isn't new. In Tudor England, Queen Jane Seymour died just days after giving Henry VIII his long-desired son. The baby, Edward VI, was declared a miracle. Jane, a footnote. Or consider Empress Maria Leopoldina of Brazil, who gave birth to several children under grueling conditions while the court kept careful score of who survived. Childbirth here isn't medical, it's military, victory or loss. You glance around the room and realise something chilling. There are no men. Not in any meaningful sense. The king isn't here. He's in another wing, likely pacing, maybe drinking, probably praying, but definitely not holding his wife's hand. That would be too intimate, too human. No, this moment belongs to the women. Midwives, ladies-in-waiting, mothers, nurses, who've done this 100 times and still never come out unscarred. And that's by design. The birthing chamber is its own little kingdom, ruled by ritual and superstition. Lavender is burned to purify the air. Mirrors are covered to prevent bad luck. The queen must not scream too much, weakness, nor remain too quiet, witchcraft. The midwife carries a blade under her skirt to cut through evil spirits, and someone's tied red thread around the queen's wrist to ensure safe passage for the soul. Medicine and magic blur here. Anything to get the baby out alive. Suddenly a cry, not from the queen, but smaller, shriller. A baby's cry. Everyone freezes. The midwife lifts the child into the air like a relic. A courtier steps forward to announce the sex. "A boy!" he proclaims, and the room erupts in cheers, clapping, even weeping. You look at the queen. Her eyes are half open, dazed, her lips barely moving. No one is looking at her. The baby has already been whisked away, cleaned, swaddled, handed to a nursemaid, and she's left there, surrounded by dozens of people, and yet completely alone. Quirky fact, in some courts, royal babies weren't allowed to be held by their mothers for days. They were passed immediately to wet nurses, bathed in wine or salt, and inspected by astrologers and nobles before the Queen could even see them again. In one particularly absurd case, a king reportedly named his son before the Queen knew the birth was successful, and the pressure doesn't stop. If it's a boy, there's relief, but also expectation. That child becomes a living embodiment of the kingdom's future. If it's a girl, there's disappointment. Maybe polite, maybe not. But the Queen will be reminded, quietly or cruelly, that she must try again, and again, until a son is born or her body gives out. Some scholars argue that royal women had more agency in childbirth than we think, that they controlled their chambers, chose their midwives, and built support networks of other powerful women. But others point to the sheer volume of maternal deaths, forced births, and ceremonial dehumanization as proof of the opposite. Either way, the child was never just hers. He, or she, belonged to the state. Back in the hallway, news spreads fast. Bells ring, announcements are read. People celebrate or pretend to. The king emerges at last, solemn, emotional, but aware that his next public words will be scrutinized, repeated, remembered. The nursemaid stands beside him, baby in arms. The baby's face is already printed on coins. And the Queen, she lies in bed, bleeding slowly into silk sheets, smiling faintly, or not at all. In the morning she'll be praised, for now she sleeps, surrounded by the echo of applause meant for her womb. The Queen is awake now, but not quite present. Her room smells of iron and rosewater, with the cloying undertone of something rotting sweet. Old blood, maybe, or just the linens no one's dared change yet. Outside, the court is celebrating. There's music in the halls, congratulations being whispered and shouted. But inside these four walls, her body lies like a battlefield. You step carefully, quiet as a shadow. The baby is gone, off to the nursery, and she's surrounded by silence, and a nurse with a worried crease in her brow. This is what they don't talk about during royal christenings or grand portraits. The aftermath, the bleeding, the fever, the tremors. The Queen tries to sit up and can't. Her body has spent everything to deliver the heir. And here, in the sacred centre of power, that body's no longer celebrated. It's monitored, managed, and, if necessary, replaced. Everyone outside assumes she's resting in luxury, but you know better now. The bed is damp, the sheets are stained. The midwife who just left had a dark spot on her apron that wasn't there before, and the Queen, her smile is brittle. There's another set of footsteps approaching already, an herbalist maybe, with something sharp smelling in a flask. She's not here to comfort, she's here to make the Queen useful again. Because the pressure doesn't ease up after one birth. In fact, it tightens. If the baby was a boy, they'll want a spare. If it was a girl, they'll want a replacement. And quickly. A Queen's worth is not proven by surviving childbirth. It's proven by doing it again and again, until either the line is secure or her body gives out. You pass down a hallway where the portraits hang, generations of queens, some with babies in their arms, others painted posthumously, pale and holy, like the Virgin Mary. The truth behind those faces is rarely discussed. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died before their names were inked into the family tree. The crown demands heirs, and it does not accept excuses. There's a particularly chilling story the court doesn't share out loud anymore. A queen of a small northern kingdom miscarried 3 times in 2 years. On the 4th, desperate to produce something, anything, her physicians instructed her to remain in bed for the full term. Her chamber pot was changed behind silk screens. Her food was whispered into the room, not delivered. When she finally gave birth to a stillborn girl, she was told to remain silent. The baby was hidden, buried in a private garden, and within days she was already being pressed by court advisors to prepare herself for another try. She did not survive the 5th attempt. Quirky fact: some courts used substitute wombs in secret. If a queen was deemed too frail or infertile, a concubine or noblewoman might be selected to carry the child, and elaborate schemes were built to disguise the truth. The royal birth would be staged, the queen would be padded for months, the real mother cloistered, the baby presented to the court as hers, unquestioned. You think that's conspiracy level? There's real historical suspicion this happened more than once. The thing is, no one cared who carried the child. Not really, as long as the bloodline was preserved. As long as the baby had the right nose, the right chin, the right destiny. It's not about mothers, it's about the continuity of power. You stop by the royal nursery and peek in. The nurse is humming something tuneless as she rocks the cradle. The child, barely a day old, already wears a bracelet of gold. There's a tiny symbol stitched into the edge of the blanket, the family crest. From the moment they take their first breath, royal babies are part of the machine. Groomed, recorded, weaponized. But as your eyes adjust to the dim light, you notice another cradle in the corner, smaller, covered with a sheet. The nurse sees your glance and shakes her head, almost imperceptibly. That one didn't make it. Twins, maybe. Or a child born too soon. There'll be no mourning, no announcement, no grave with a name, just a closed door and a forgotten heartbeat. The Queen doesn't know, or maybe she does. The palace has ways of folding silence over tragedy until it feels like peace. Back in her chamber, she's being fed spoonfuls of warm broth laced with something bitter. A restorative, they say, but it's probably just a sedative. She's crying now, but only slightly. Maybe it's relief. Maybe pain. Maybe she's already calculating how long she has before someone starts asking when the next one is coming. There's a saying whispered among ladies in waiting. The Queen may wear the crown, but her belly wears the kingdom. You didn't understand it before, you do now. And of course, all of this, the loss, the pressure, the substitutions, never makes it into the paintings or the court records. The official story is always the same. A prince was born. The Queen smiled. The kingdom rejoiced. The suffering is invisible. That's the point. It has to be. The illusion of control is more important than the reality of survival. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how much choice royal women really had in this system. Some suggest they were complicit, active players in a brutal game. Others argue they were casualties, trapped by the roles they were born into. Either way, their bodies were battlegrounds. Their choices, if they had any, were swallowed by duty. Outside, the court celebrates still. Another toast is raised, another banner hung, another speech written about strength, continuity, and the glory of birth. But in this quiet corner of the palace, the Queen closes her eyes and tries to forget how much she had to give up for a single name in a family line. And somewhere, someone is already counting the days until she tries again. By midday, the palace is back in full motion. The baby's birth has lit a spark through every gilded hallway, every whisper-prone salon, every chamber echoing with clinking goblets. A royal child, an heir, a potential ruler, means security, celebration, and a fresh round of power games. But beneath the surface, there's something more insidious, a quiet sharpening of knives. Because in a royal court, sex isn't just personal, it's political weaponry. And now that the line of succession has inched forward, everyone's calculating how to bend it to their advantage. You're in a corner of the grand audience chamber now, watching the nobles file in to offer their congratulations to the king. They kiss his hand, they smile at the nursemaid holding the swaddled infant. But behind the grins are schemes, because the arrival of one child has the potential to make, or break, dozens of futures. A rival might be eliminated, a family line might be pushed out of inheritance. A distant cousin might suddenly find himself second in line to a throne he never expected. And the most powerful strategy of all? Seduction. You catch sight of a duchess trailing her fingers along the rim of a silver goblet, her gaze locked onto the foreign ambassador across the room. That look. Not about love. It's about leverage. If she can get close to him, close enough to whisper secrets between kisses or slip documents beneath sheets, she can sway trade deals, borders, and treaties. And if she gets pregnant, well, then things really get interesting. Because in royal courts, illegitimate children weren't just scandals, they were bargaining chips. A noblewoman who bore a royal bastard might be disgraced publicly, but privately, she could wield enormous power. The child might be legitimized. He might be granted land, a title, even a place in succession if no legitimate heirs survived. And if the father was foreign, That child could become a bridge or a threat between two kingdoms. You duck out of the crowd and make your way into a private parlour where a few lords are hunched over a chessboard, not so subtly drawing parallels between pawns and princesses. One of them mentions a baroness who was sent to seduce a prince in another court, not for fun, but to extract secrets. He brags that her letters were coded in the margins of love poems and hidden in her hair comb. She slept with him 3 times. On the 4th, she disappeared. Whether she was found out or simply finished her mission, no one knows. Quirky fact: Catherine de' Medici, queen and power broker extraordinaire, was said to have maintained a team of beautiful spies known as her flying squadron. Elegantly dressed women trained in the art of seduction and planted throughout European courts to gather intelligence through pillow talk. Basically, state-sanctioned espionage wrapped in lace. But it wasn't just women. Male courtiers, especially handsome young ones, were often deployed as bait too. In some cases, they seduced older noblewomen or foreign queens to gain favour, or blackmail material. And blackmail was a common currency. A single night of passion could become decades of leverage. We have letters, someone might whisper. We have witnesses. In a world where appearances were everything, that kind of evidence could bring down dynasties. You stop in a gallery filled with tapestries and overhear a pair of maids gossiping. A nobleman, they say, was caught sneaking out of the Queen Dowager's chamber. He's already married, of course, but apparently the old queen still had enough influence, and perhaps affection, to be worth his nighttime visits. The maids giggle, but you know it's not just a joke. If true, the implications could be devastating. That nobleman just aligned himself with a rival power faction, and if anyone finds out, he might lose everything. And then there's the story of Lady T, told only in corners and in code. She seduced the crown prince, bore him a son in secret, and threatened to reveal it only when her family's estates were threatened with seizure. She won, of course. Her family kept their land. The child was sent abroad. Years later, he returned as a military commander, officially unrelated, unofficially untouchable. Historians still argue about how often sex was used explicitly for political gain versus incidentally. Some claim most of these affairs were just messy human entanglements, later reinterpreted through a political lens. Others argue the court taught seduction like a skill, an unofficial curriculum of charm, timing, and plausible deniability. One thing's for sure, in this world, intimacy and strategy are never far apart. And the risks? Enormous. If a seduction failed, if a lover betrayed a confidence, or a pregnancy occurred out of alignment with political goals, it could mean exile, imprisonment, even execution. One young noblewoman was rumoured to have thrown herself from a tower rather than reveal who fathered her child. The records say suicide. The servants whisper murder. The truth, as always, lies somewhere no one dares dig. Back in the Great Hall, the king now holds the child in his arms for the first official portrait. The nursemaid steps aside. Everyone claps, but across the room, 2 noblemen lock eyes in a cold, calculating stare. Behind them, a lady adjusts the hem of her dress and glances toward the prince. Somewhere someone has already decided who she'll try to seduce next. Because in this palace, every bed is a potential battleground, every kiss, a contract, every lover, a spy or a scandal waiting to detonate. You step into the hallway, the noise muffled behind you, and pause by a window. Outside, the garden is quiet, peaceful, honest, in a way nothing inside this palace is, but you know it won't last. Somewhere tonight another affair is beginning, not with romance, but with intent. Because when power is passed through bloodlines, sex is never just sex, it's war by other means. By now, you've probably started to see the pattern. Desire in a royal palace is never just a matter of the heart, or even the body. It's a currency, traded and hoarded, stolen and spent. But when bloodlines are treated like holy scripts, and purity is valued above reality, things tend to spiral into strange and dark corners. Tonight, we're going to crack open one of the ugliest truths in royal history. Inbreeding, incest, and the desperate obsession with keeping royal blood pure. You're standing in the portrait gallery again, but this time you're noticing something different. Not the jewellery, not the brocade, the faces. They all have the same long jaw, the same heavy eyelids, the same pale, fragile look of someone who's never been outside for more than 10 minutes. These are the Habsburgs, and their most famous genetic legacy, the Habsburg jaw, is the result of generations of intermarriage. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces. Because when your number one priority is keeping your royal line untainted, suddenly your family tree starts looking like a tangled mess of repetition and denial. Take Charles II of Spain. His family tree is less of a tree and more of a very tired vine. By the time he was born, he had more shared DNA from repeated ancestral marriages than is comfortable to think about. He suffered from developmental delays, couldn't speak clearly until age 4, and was unable to chew his food without assistance well into adulthood. His jaw was so pronounced and misaligned that his tongue didn't sit comfortably in his mouth. And, of course, the real problem, from the royal perspective, he was sterile, the last of his line, the prize for centuries of dynastic paranoia. But it wasn't just the Habsburgs. Royal houses across Europe followed the same blueprint. Marry your cousin, then marry their cousin. Keep the money, the land, the power within the family, literally. They saw outsiders as threats. Genetic diversity was for peasants. And if a little drool and cognitive decline showed up in the next generation, well, you simply covered it with a larger collar and painted them looking thoughtful. You glance over at a portrait of an Austrian archduchess who married her first cousin when she was 15. Her mother had married her own uncle. Her grandmother was also her great-aunt. It reads like a math problem written by someone who hates children and chromosomes, and yet they genuinely believed they were protecting the divine right of kings. A quirky example. The Ptolemies of ancient Egypt, including Cleopatra herself, frequently married their siblings. Not just cousins, full siblings. Cleopatra's family had so thoroughly entangled itself through generations of intra-family marriage that historians still debate which of her many brother husbands fathered which child. Royal blood, they insisted, must not mix with the common. And what about the children? Well, let's just say not everyone survived. Infant mortality in royal families was higher than you'd expect, not because they lacked resources, but because genetic disorders quietly flourished behind gilded doors. Haemophilia became famously associated with Queen Victoria's descendants, spreading through European courts like a beautifully dressed curse. Nicholas II's son, Alexei Romanov, was a haemophiliac. One wrong bruise could have killed him. His illness played a major role in destabilizing the Russian monarchy. Why? Because the family turned to Rasputin, a wandering mystic and part-time party crasher who promised healing. One thing led to another, and boom, empire, gone. Some historians argue that royal inbreeding wasn't as universal as we think, that there were plenty of marriages outside the immediate gene pool, but even they agree that the obsession with legitimacy often overrode any common sense. Legitimacy, of course, didn't mean sane or healthy or remotely functional. It meant connected by blood to the right people, even if those people were your aunt and your nephew's sister wife. And then there are the darker rumours, whispers of incest that weren't arranged by marriage contracts, but happened behind closed doors, out of sight and absolutely out of line. One notorious case involves Don Carlos, the son of King Philip II of Spain, who reportedly exhibited violent, unstable behaviour from a young age, burning people's feet, smashing windows, torturing animals. His family's solution? Lock him in a room. He died at 23 after being confined for months without food or light. Some modern historians believe his behaviour wasn't just madness, it was the tragic outcome of too many overlapping bloodlines and not enough genetic breathing room. You walk through another corridor, this one lined with relics and glass cases. Inside are tiny shoes, lockets of hair, little cradles carved from ivory, symbols of children who never reached adulthood. For every prince who lived long enough to wear a crown, there were 3 or 4 siblings who didn't survive infancy. And it wasn't always cholera or plague. Sometimes it was just their bodies failing under the weight of too much family resemblance. Of course, no one called it inbreeding at the time. It was strategic marriage. It was preserving the line. The word incest was avoided unless it came from a scandal, and even then, only whispered. A young noblewoman who got too close to her brother might be quietly shipped off to a convent. A prince whose affection for his cousin became too public might suddenly find himself volunteering for a military campaign far away. You don't air the family laundry when the monarchy is the laundry. And you wonder how much of this was denial. How many queens, staring down at their frail, sickly infants, pretended they didn't see the pattern? How many physicians wrote off deformities as accidents of birth, when the real diagnosis was generations of kissing cousins? Even today, some royal houses carry genetic legacies they'd rather not talk about. It's easier to romanticize the past, to paint over the truth with elegance and oil portraits. But here, in this wing of the palace, you see the reality in the artifacts no one puts on display. A crib with broken slats, a rattle carved for a child who never learned to grip, a portrait of a boy who died at 5, smiling with the same jaw as his doomed uncle. And somewhere, in a forgotten corner, a tapestry quietly unravels, not from age, but from the weight of everything it was meant to cover up. You find yourself now in the quietest part of the palace, not quiet because no one's there, but because the people who are there have learned how to move without being noticed. This is the corridor where the rules don't quite apply, where the glances last a little too long, the handshakes linger, and behind every locked door something sacred and dangerous is being hidden. Tonight, you're stepping into the realm of queer love in royal courts, a history erased, rewritten or whispered through centuries of fear and desire. The official records, of course, are silent. They always are. You won't find scrolls labelled the king's male lover in the royal archives. But between the gaps in marriage announcements, between the hurried decisions to exile a particular valet, between the strangely affectionate letters between cousins that start, "My dearest companion," and end with entire paragraphs of longing, yeah, the truth has always been there, just not where you were told to look. You slip into a room off the main corridor, modest by royal standards, with a canopy bed and a desk cluttered with inkpots and discarded quills. On the bed lies a small box, no lock, just ribbon tied. You open it. Inside are letters, no names, but the handwriting is unmistakable. Carefully scripted, private, confessional. They speak of shared dreams, fear of discovery, the taste of a kiss in candlelight. "The scent of your hair lingers on my collar," one says. "I would trade the throne for one more night." You pause. This isn't a servant writing to a noblewoman. This is someone high up, someone with too much to lose. One name surfaces again and again in the margins of royal gossip. King James I of England, whose intense affection for his male courtiers, particularly George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, raised more than a few powdered eyebrows. James called him "my sweet child and wife," and their letters, surviving despite centuries of scandal, are charged with warmth and intimacy that even the most creatively closeted historians can't ignore. Still, many try. For years, scholars insisted these were just platonic friendships, the kind of emotional openness men once shared, and sure, maybe some were. But when one prince writes another about the agony of being apart and ends the note with, "Would I could kiss your lips into silence," let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't a chess game, it was a love story, just one that had to stay behind closed doors. You step out into a moonlit hallway and hear hushed voices from behind a velvet curtain. A page boy, no older than 16, is whispering something to a slightly older scribe. The tone is tender, intimate, not playful. You back away quietly, because even here, even in a place where affairs of all kinds are common knowledge, this kind of intimacy is still the most forbidden of all. Not because it's rare, because it's feared. Throughout history, same-sex love among royalty was often more tolerated in practice than in public. In ancient Greece, male-male relationships were common among the elite, often encouraged as part of courtly mentorship. But as Christian dominance took hold in Europe, tolerance was replaced by laws, by church decrees, by execution orders wrapped in velvet. By the time you get to Renaissance courts, same-sex desire hasn't vanished. It's just gone underground. A quirky footnote: Queen Christina of Sweden. Brilliant, defiant, and famously uninterested in marriage, Christina wore men's clothing, refused to marry, and formed deeply emotional, possibly romantic bonds with her female courtiers, especially Ebba Sparre. In her letters she calls Ebba her bedfellow and the darling of my heart. When Christina abdicated the throne, some say it was in part to escape the suffocating expectations of royal womanhood. She converted to Catholicism, moved to Rome, and spent her final years scandalizing everyone with her independence. The debate still rages. Were these relationships sexual or just emotionally intense friendships? Historians argue. Queer people recognize the subtext. Sometimes, the silence between the words says more than the words ever could. You're led now through an old library, one of those places where time hangs in the air like dust. A court archivist with crooked spectacles pulls out a slim leather-bound journal. It belonged to a 17th century French nobleman, favoured at court, never married. Inside are coded passages, poetic and strange, referencing a midnight garden and the fox who visits only when the moon is high. It sounds like nonsense until you read between the lines. The fox was his lover. The garden, a disused greenhouse on the edge of the palace where they met under the pretence of botanical study. And when they were discovered, the nobleman was sent to a remote estate. The lover, likely a footman, disappeared from the records. Entire lives, erased to preserve the fiction of royal decorum. And yet, they kept trying. They kept loving. Because that's what humans do, even when everything is against them. They found ways to write, to meet, to touch. They invented codes, stories, songs. One prince gave his lover a harp with strings tuned to their favourite key. A duchess smuggled a letter inside a hollowed-out prayer book. A queen's lady-in-waiting carved initials into the underside of a chessboard no one ever flipped. Was it dangerous? Always. In some places, sodomy was punishable by death. In others, by exile, humiliation, or forced marriage. Even rumours could ruin a career. A man accused of inversion might never hold office again. A woman suspected of loving women could be married off to a distant baron or locked in a convent with nothing but regret and hymns. Still, the palace kept their secrets. Most of them. Love left its fingerprints on the walls, in the journals, in the forgotten corners where two people might have risked everything just for a moment of being seen. You pass one last room before returning to your own. It's locked, but you press your ear to the wood. Silence. Then, faintly, just faintly, you hear laughter. Two voices, close together. Even here, behind these walls of power and tradition, love blooms in the cracks, quiet, defiant, real. By morning the palace is humming with a new kind of tension. Not the usual formal chaos of political manoeuvring or marriage negotiations, but something more urgent, more bodily. You're walking through a marble corridor that opens onto the edge of the servants' quarter, and you can feel it before you see it. The scent of sweat, perfume, and something sweeter. Too sweet. Musk, rosewater, wine. And beneath it all, the unmistakable air of indulgence. Because not all palace secrets are hidden under titles and veils. Some are simply next door. Welcome to the brothel beside the throne. Officially it doesn't exist. Ask any noble, and they'll insist the palace maintains the utmost dignity. But slip through the right courtyard, past the garden where no one gardens, and into a side building dressed to look like a wine cellar, and you'll find the truth. It's a salon technically. But the wine is a warm-up, and the conversations are never the point. Red silk curtains, cushions piled high, candlelight bouncing off mirrors, none of this is for politics. The royal court has always known how to separate the sacred from the sensual. That's why brothels frequented by nobles were often placed alarmingly close to royal residences, sometimes within walking distance, sometimes on the palace grounds. The idea was simple: control the chaos by keeping it close. Let the bloodlines remain pure, while the appetites are handled in designated places, staffed by women and men trained to flatter, to please, and most importantly, to forget. Tonight, a new girl has arrived. Young, sharp-eyed, and already being watched too closely by a minor noble, with a minor title and major hands. She's not shocked by any of it. She's here for coin and stability. For her, this is safer than starving on the street. Safer than serving in the kitchen where the cooks will pour at her anyway. At least here, she sets the rules. or so she tells herself. You sit back in the corner and observe. Courtiers float in, already half drunk, murmuring about appointments and hunting trips, while their fingers trail lazily across someone else's knee. One of the girls plays a lute with more precision than the palace musicians. Another recites poetry in 6 languages. These aren't just workers, they're professionals, educated and attuned to the rhythms of power, and they know things the court pretends not to hear. Quirky historical side note. In 18th century France, the term demi-mondaine described women who existed in that liminal space between courtesan and noblewoman. They dressed like aristocrats, lived off secret stipends from high-ranking lovers, and often had more political influence than ambassadors. Some were so entrenched in the court's social ecosystem that their disappearances caused panic. You look around the room again. That man whispering into the ear of a girl draped in emerald silk, he's a foreign envoy. The girl, a long-time favourite. They're not flirting, they're negotiating. The brothel has become the back channel. In a world where official meetings are too formal and marriage too slow, this is where deals happen. In bed, over wine, between breathless sighs and casual betrayals. You overhear a conversation between 2 men near the back wall. They're talking about a countess, one of the king's former mistresses, who's been sneaking out at night. She's not going to confession. She's visiting this place. Not for sex, but for information. The workers here hear everything, which means they know everything. And if you're smart, you keep them on your side. Of course, not everyone approves. Some court factions campaign constantly to have these places shut down, claiming they're immoral, degrading, dangerous, and sometimes they are. Girls go missing. Diseases spread. There are cover-ups, sudden marriages, mysterious deaths. But for every brothel condemned, 2 more appear under new names with the same patrons. You can't legislate away desire. You can only redirect it. There's a story still floating through the court of a prince, unnamed, though everyone knows, which means everyone gossips in code. He fathered 3 children with one of the brothel's most well-known girls. 2 died young, the 3rd was sent away, paid for handsomely, never spoken of again, until he returned, as a soldier, decorated, handsome, looking exactly like the prince. The resemblance was so uncanny, the king's advisors asked if he should be removed. The prince said no. The soldier went on to marry a duchess's cousin, and now attends royal dinners, never seated too far, never acknowledged. And then there's the royal hypocrisy, where queens are expected to bear heirs and stay virtuous, while kings are almost encouraged to seek satisfaction elsewhere. A common phrase in the Spanish court, let the king sin so long as the line remains holy. That's the line. That's the limit. Adultery is fine, as long as it doesn't tangle the inheritance. You step outside for air and spot a narrow alley behind the building, half shaded by creeping vines. A woman leans against the wall, smoking something laced with poppy, staring up at the sky like it owes her something. She nods to you once, not unfriendly, just tired. She's been here for 5 years, long enough to see 2 kings, 4 queens, and more bastards than she can count. She tells you something before you go. We remember what they forget. It stays with you. Because that's the truth. The people in these salons and brothels, in these gilded half-spaces between pleasure and power, are the ones who remember the things the palace tries to bury. The real fathers, the real lovers, the secrets slipped in between silken sheets and whispered between false moans and real pain. You head back through the gate, back into the palace proper. The air is colder, the silence tighter. No one speaks of where you've been. They all know, of course, but pretending is a skill everyone here has mastered, because the palace is pure, officially. Everything else? It happens just next door. The chapel stands in the heart of the palace like a stone spine, cold, silent, and always watching. Sunlight pours through stained glass windows in fractured colours, painting saints and angels across the floor, which is polished so perfectly you can see your sins reflected in it. You step inside and feel it immediately. The weight, not just of faith, but of surveillance disguised as salvation. This is where the royals confess, where the clergy bless, and where the palace pretends that all those moans, manipulations, and midnight trysts didn't happen. Welcome to the uneasy marriage between the church and the royal bedroom. Here, sex is not a private act, it's moral currency. And like all currency, it's watched, measured, and taxed, sometimes literally. You walk past pews lined with velvet cushions reserved for the nobility, their family crests embroidered like warnings. Above the altar hangs a crucifix so heavy it looks like it might crash down if someone lied hard enough during Mass. Someone probably already has. The king arrives first, flanked by his confessor and 2 cardinals who look like they were carved from wine-soaked wood. He kneels. Not for God, you think, but for optics. This is what penance looks like when the court knows you've been caught. Because no matter how many mistresses parade through the palace, the church still demands an apology when the public starts asking questions. The Queen arrives next, her face pale and unreadable, dressed in modest grey with a veil that hides everything but her hands, gloved, trembling just slightly. She doesn't kneel, she sits, because she doesn't need forgiveness, she needs witnesses. Everyone knows about the affair now. The king's latest favourite caught slipping out of his chambers by a night guard too new to know better than to look the other way. The scandal is spreading, and the church has been summoned to mop up the mess with incense and shame. It wasn't always this delicate. In medieval Europe, the church ruled royal sexuality with an iron prayer book. Marriages had to be sanctioned, consummated, and, in cases of political inconvenience, annulled, all under ecclesiastical supervision. Bedroom troubles were church matters, impotence, investigated, infertility, examined, adultery, punished, unless you were the king, in which case it was addressed. One bizarre historical example. In 1066, King Philip I of France tried to marry a woman already married to someone else. The Pope excommunicated him, not once but twice. Philip shrugged, kept his mistress, and ran his kingdom anyway. The excommunication was lifted when he got old and sick and decided he should probably hedge his bets on the afterlife. But even when the church cracked down, it often did so with selective blindness. As long as the public displays were acceptable, the private indulgences could be quietly ignored. You weren't expected to be holy, just discreet. The problem came when sex and scandal spilled past the bedroom and into the pews. You take a seat in the back row as the priest begins his sermon. It's about loyalty, not to God specifically, but to duty, to the crown, to the image of the crown. You look around and see the usual suspects. Nobles pretending to listen, servants pretending not to, and ministers pretending to be too important for scandal. You can practically hear their thoughts. Just get through this, make the donation, and let the whispers die down. Of course, when it comes to sex, the church has never quite figured out its position. On paper, celibacy, chastity, no touchy-touchy unless it's for procreation. In practice, cloisters and monasteries have seen their fair share of forbidden love stories. There are records of nuns giving birth in secret, of monks confessing to each other in ways that made the confessional blush. One quirky and very real moment in history. In the 14th century, the Bishop of Pamiers in France was caught keeping a brothel inside his episcopal palace. His defence? That he didn't want young clergy wandering into the towns and getting caught. Better to sin under supervision. It sounds like satire, but it's from the church's own records. The palace has learned to mimic the same balance. Sin in secret, repent in public. You're reminded of a queen who, years ago, was rumoured to be in love with her personal chaplain. Nothing was ever proven. Of course not. But after a particularly long confession, she began attending daily mass, took up charity work and started sleeping in a separate wing from the king. When asked about the change, she simply said, "I've drawn closer to God." The scholars still debate what role the church truly played in policing royal morality. Some say the clergy were puppets, blessing whatever the crown ordered. Others believe they were moral anchors, pulling rulers back from absolute corruption. The truth? It varied. Some cardinals were ruthless manipulators, using knowledge of affairs to gain influence. Others tried genuinely to steer kings toward better behaviour, and were usually ignored until their deaths, or demotions. Back in the chapel, the king is rising now, his expression carefully blank. The priest sprinkles holy water in his direction. The crowd watches, silent, almost bored. The public apology has been made. The sin is now official, which means it can be forgotten, for now. As the congregation begins to file out, you follow the Queen into a side chamber. Alone, she removes her gloves. Her hands are red, cracked at the knuckles. You realise she's been praying, actually praying. Maybe not for forgiveness, but for the power to endure the performance. She doesn't speak, just stares into the candlelight until it flickers, and then she turns to you, eyes sharp. They always ask if he repents, she says. No one ever asks if I forgive. That silence hangs heavier than the stained glass shadows. You return to your own quarters and sit by the window, watching the chapel fade into the evening mist. Another scandal buried beneath a hymn. Another sermon used to smooth over lust in a velvet cloak. Because in the palace, the church doesn't really want purity. It wants order. Confession isn't about cleansing the soul. It's about keeping the lie in place. The palace is quiet tonight. Not with peace, but with reverence. The unsettling kind. The kind that hangs in the air like incense, as if something divine just passed through the corridor and left a strange aftertaste behind. You've noticed something lately, something unsettling. In this world where royalty is inherited and not earned, where one's birthright is dressed in silk and hung with medals, sex isn't just politics, it's sacred. Or at least that's the performance. Because what better way to justify indulgence than by calling it divine? You find yourself in one of the oldest wings of the palace, a chamber lined with murals, faded now but still visible in candlelight. Angels with golden halos, saints with pained expressions, and in the centre, a painting of a king on a grand bed, arms raised, eyes toward heaven, as if his orgasm was a religious experience. It's not a mistake. This was painted on purpose, commissioned in fact. Because here, royal sex isn't just tolerated, it's ordained. You might scoff, but this wasn't unique. Across history, monarchs have wrapped their desire in spiritual justification. Kings claimed divine right, not just to rule, but to touch, to take, to procreate at will. Their bodies, after all, were chosen by God. And if they lay with someone, it wasn't lust, it was part of the divine order, an extension of power, of purpose. One of the oldest examples comes from ancient Mesopotamia, where kings would perform a sacred marriage ritual, literally sleep with a priestess of the goddess Inanna to ensure fertility for the land. A public ceremonial act. The people would gather and celebrate it. The king's orgasm was believed to bless the crops. A good harvest meant he did his job well. Talk about pressure. You hear footsteps behind you and turn to see a young priest entering the chamber, carrying a velvet-bound book and a quiet smirk. He's part of the court's spiritual advisory team, though that term is misleading. He's not here to enforce morality, he's here to interpret it, to provide the religious script for the monarch's decisions, even when those decisions involve late-night visits, hidden pregnancies, or a sudden change in marital status. The priest tells you of a ceremony once held here decades ago to bless the king's bed after a particularly fruitful year. Candles were lit, psalms were recited, a chalice was passed around. The royal couple even received sacramental wine before retiring for the evening, as if they were not just going to conceive a child, but perform a ritual necessary to uphold the nation's covenant with God. And then, of course, there's the language. Everything about royal sex is wrapped in euphemism. The king visited the queen. She was in receipt of his affection. When she became pregnant, it was not biology, it was providence. Midwives spoke of divine implantation. The child wasn't conceived, he was bestowed. It makes you wonder if anyone even believed it, or if it was all theatre for an audience too terrified to call it out. There's a particularly strange tradition in the French court, a story that lingers even now. When Louis XIV's mistress gave birth to their first child, he allegedly ordered a special mass in honour of the event. Not for the baby's soul, but to thank God for the king's virility. The clergy went along with it. What else could they do? Questioning the king's sexuality was, in effect, questioning divine will. You walk now through the inner sanctum of the palace chapel, where a smaller altar rests behind thick curtains. This is not the public space. This is the monarch's private sanctuary. The room is saturated with silence. Candles burn low. On the altar, a single gold ring sits in a glass case, the wedding band of a long-dead queen who, according to legend, died on her wedding night after a royal consummation ceremony went violently wrong. She was 17. The story was rewritten as a tragic martyrdom. Her face was painted with a halo. You move on, stomach twisting. There's a fringe theory you've overheard scholars whisper about, that some royal courts leaned into the mythos so deeply they actually ritualized sex, not just behind closed doors, but as part of their broader philosophy of power. In Renaissance courts, mysticism and alchemy ran alongside theology. Sex wasn't just for heirs, it was a conduit. The act itself was believed to produce not just children, but energy, vital essence. Some believed the king's orgasm could increase his aura, his divine spark. It's absurd, right? And yet here you are in a hallway of relics dedicated not to saints, but to former kings' intimate lives. Locks of hair, bedposts engraved with prayer, a small silver spoon said to have stirred the conception tonic for a king's nightly ritual. Not medical, not romantic, religious. You reach a small sitting room once used by Queen Eleanor, sharp-witted, childless, and whispered to have taken celibacy as a spiritual rebellion. Some historians argue she turned down the king's advances not because of illness or distaste, but because she believed he abused the sanctity of the act. She wrote letters to her confessor filled with guilt, not for refusing her husband, but for failing in her duty to God by not wanting children with a man she considered impure. It's bleak, but it's honest. And then there's the reverse. Queens who use their sexuality as a spiritual claim. One famous case? A consort who claimed visions of angels before each time she slept with the king, suggesting divine sanction. Her opponents said she was manipulating the court. Her supporters said she was a vessel for God. Either way, she became untouchable until she didn't bear a son. Historians still debate whether these rituals and beliefs were sincere or just performance. Did the monarchs truly believe their sex lives had a higher purpose, or were they simply justifying indulgence behind a curtain of incense and Latin? You step outside into the evening breeze. Somewhere in the palace, the king is preparing for a ceremonial visit to his queen. It's not love, it's obligation, a public schedule. The clergy are already preparing the chapel. The midwives stand ready. There will be no passion, no spontaneity, just a quiet, practiced rhythm dressed in piety. Because when your body belongs to a throne, and the church sits beside your bed, even sex becomes a sacrament of power. And you're just a witness, watching the divine unfold in the dark. It starts, like most things in royal life, with a whisper, a glance that lingers too long, a door that closes too softly, a servant who talks too freely after too much wine. And then, before anyone's quite ready for it, the whisper becomes a name, and the name becomes a headline. Well, the 18th century version of one. The scandal has landed. It sweeps through the palace like smoke, curling under doors and climbing up tapestries. And in a place where privacy is a myth and purity is a performance, a sex scandal isn't just gossip, it's a political earthquake. Tonight you're in Versailles again, because where else would we be for a truly dramatic royal mess? It's the 1770s, and the French court is cracking beneath its own opulence. Inside the hall of mirrors, nobles pretend to laugh while their eyes dart sideways, scanning for reactions, for rumours, for confirmation. The queen is under siege. The king looks half asleep, and somewhere across the court a duchess just fainted for effect. It's not subtle. But then again it never is when sex threatens the throne. At the centre of it all is Marie Antoinette, or rather, what people have chosen to believe about her. She's extravagant, foreign, unrelatable, and now, apparently, unfaithful. The affair of the diamond necklace hasn't happened yet, but the court is already thick with pamphlets accusing her of everything from sleeping with guards to carrying on with female courtiers in dark corners. It doesn't matter that there's no proof. The image is enough. If the queen can be sexualized, she can be controlled. You sit in a salon where nobles sip brandy and pretend not to read the latest libelous tract, which of course they've memorized. It describes the queen's secret passageways, her alleged midnight orgies, her taste for silk restraints. None of it is true, or maybe parts of it are. The truth doesn't matter. The pamphlet has been passed from hand to hand, read aloud in whispers, printed by candlelight in basements, sold outside bakeries. Scandal, after all, is a form of rebellion. You glance down at the page. One passage reads, "The Queen bathes in milk, not to soften her skin, but to cleanse herself of sin." It's poetry with teeth. And the damage? Immediate. Because sex scandals don't just hurt reputations, they challenge the legitimacy of rule itself. If the Queen is unfaithful, is the heir truly royal? If the king is impotent, who's really in charge? Quirky fact. During the height of France's court scandal culture, the most popular books weren't religious tracts or treatises on governance. They were libels, smutty little political gossip pamphlets, often written anonymously, printed illegally, and consumed like candy. The line between pornography and propaganda was delightfully non-existent. And France wasn't alone. Over in England, Charles II's many mistresses earned nicknames, portraits, titles, and eventually influence over the crown. But when Queen Caroline was rumoured to have taken lovers, it was treated as sedition. When Victoria's close male confidants inspired gossip, denial, destruction, erasure. Because here's the unspoken rule. The monarch may misbehave, but never lose control. The moment a scandal makes the ruler seem vulnerable, emotionally needy, sexually unfit, romantically obsessed, it becomes more than a juicy story. It becomes a threat. You step into a drawing room where ministers are whispering over chessboards and trays of sugared fruit. They're discussing the fallout of a much more recent scandal. A prince caught with an opera singer backstage, her bodice half undone, his coat missing. Nothing unusual, really, except for the fact that she was engaged to a rival noble, and now there's talk of duels, cancelled trade agreements, and political blackmail over a single dress rehearsal. Historians argue whether some of these scandals were real or planted, manufactured as tools in the endless palace chess match. Want to undermine a queen's influence? Suggest she's in love with her lady-in-waiting? Want to discredit a rising noble? Leak rumours about a bastard child? It's not always about sex. Sometimes it's about timing. You think of Catherine the Great, whose real achievements, modernising Russia, expanding its empire, are still overshadowed by stories of her allegedly dying in bed with a horse. Not true, never was, but the scandal stuck, because it made her dangerous in a way people could laugh at. Power, after all, must always be mocked when it doesn't play by the expected rules. In another wing of the palace you find a small chamber where portraits of disgraced nobles once hung. Now only the hooks remain. One was executed, one vanished. Another, falsely accused of seducing the Queen, was exiled, his estate seized. The proof of his innocence came too late. The accusation, not the act, was enough. And the public? Oh, they adore it. They gobble up every detail like it's sacred scripture. The closer a royal sex scandal gets to the crown, the more exciting it becomes. These people aren't just monarchs, they're characters in a live-action drama, and the whole kingdom is watching. When a mistress is caught, when a chambermaid goes missing, when a noble's secret diary is leaked, the palace might tremble, but the city outside, it buzzes. You remember a letter you saw once penned by a nobleman in exile? They may have taken my titles, my lands, my honour, but I know the king's secrets, and so long as I live, they are never safe. He was found dead weeks later. Official cause? Suicide. The servants whispered otherwise. Back in your quarters, you can still hear the rustle of rumours travelling down the corridors. The Queen's ladies have been called for a private audience. The king hasn't left his study in 3 days. A letter was intercepted, a diary found. Another scandal is blooming right on schedule. Because in this palace, sex isn't just scandal. It's a weapon, a mirror, a performance. And once it escapes the bedchamber and lands in the court, no one walks away clean. The palace, for all its opulence and control, leaks. Not just secrets whispered under velvet drapes or scandals tiptoeing through side halls, but stories. Raw, handwritten, unfiltered stories. And while official records shape the history books, it's in these diaries and memoirs, the hidden, impulsive, half-burned fragments of daily life, that the truth of royal desire lives and breathes. You're in the archive wing now, beneath the palace itself, where air smells like parchment and neglect, and the dust on the shelves is older than half the family trees upstairs. No tour guides lead guests here, no courtiers linger in admiration. These aren't the glory rooms, these are the boxes they hoped no one would open. You sit at a narrow table, thumbing through a leather-bound journal with cracked corners and ink blotches like small bruises. The handwriting is delicate but furious, like someone trying to write faster than they can think. It belonged to a maid in waiting to a queen long since erased from official portraits. Her entries shift from details about wardrobe duties and spilled wine to increasingly intimate observations. The way the queen watched one of her ladies undress, the blush that followed, the deliberate avoidance that came next. They act like their bodies are dangerous, she writes, and maybe they are. Elsewhere in the journal there are records of footsteps outside the queen's chamber, of a letter found and replaced, of a name scratched out violently. It's not a confession. It's a chronicle of observation, told by someone who didn't know if what she saw was treason or just love. You pull another volume from the shelf, this one thicker, lined with gold. It's a nobleman's memoir written late in life, long after his courtly influence had waned. He writes with bitterness and longing, often in the same sentence. The king never kissed me in daylight, one page reads, but in candlelight he was gentle, almost human. No names, of course. But the context is unmistakable. He was a favourite. Then he wasn't. He describes one dinner where his chair was moved 2 seats down. That was the first sign. Then his hunting privileges were revoked. Then his rooms were reassigned. The final entry. He passed me in the corridor today and said nothing. The silence was heavier than any insult. That's the thing about palace intimacy. It can be sudden and electric, but its withdrawal is cold, clinical and devastating. Royal affection is never private. When it dies publicly, with witnesses, and often with receipts. Quirky fact. In the 17th century, the English court saw a flurry of anonymous poetry and prose passed around like contraband. These weren't romantic epics. They were thinly veiled accounts of actual affairs, written by the participants themselves. Some were pure revenge. One duchess penned an entire cycle of poems about her lover's incompetence in bed, sharing them with select guests at her salon. He retaliated by leaking her letters. Nothing was sacred, least of all dignity. But perhaps the most fascinating voices come from those who weren't meant to be heard at all. Servants, attendants, and dismissed lovers, scribbling their truths on scraps of paper never meant for royal eyes. You find one such note, unsigned, stuffed into a ledger of royal expenditures. It's a plea or maybe a threat. If you do not write, I will show them the sheets. I swear I kept them. The handwriting is jagged. You can almost feel the tremor in the hand that wrote it. Somewhere, sometime, someone loved recklessly and was discarded. You ask the archivist about the policy on preserving these documents. He shrugs. Some are real, some are fake, some are planted, some are forgotten until it's politically useful to remember them. That sounds about right. There's an ongoing academic debate about how much faith we should place in these personal writings. Diaries lie, memory distorts, lovers exaggerate. But what they offer, what the official histories never do, is the texture of royal sex, the shame, the hope, the cruelty, the waiting. They show us the parts that portraits and records edit out. You find one more document, small, folded, hidden between 2 pages of court protocol. A letter from a queen to a childhood friend written in a looping, uncertain hand. She writes, "I never knew it would be like this. That love could be so lonely when dressed in gold. He does not see me. Only the title. I miss being touched without duty." There's a wine stain in the corner. A tear mark, maybe. You read the letter twice, then slip it back exactly where you found it. Somewhere above your head, the court is laughing again, toasting something, dancing, flirting, as always. But beneath their powdered wigs and practiced charm, you wonder how many are still haunted by the things they wrote in ink, or the things they never dared write at all. The queen, the favourite, the maid, the prince, all of them, living through touches that could end legacies and kisses that couldn't be acknowledged in daylight. And yet, Here in this dark archive, the truth lingers, quiet, aching, and alive. Because what survives of royal desire isn't the scandals we remember. It's the lines that were too soft, too dangerous, too real to make it into the official story. But they're here, and they're still whispering that the bastard children of royalty are like ghosts in the palace. Everyone sees them, no one admits they're there. They appear at court dinners, carefully placed 3 seats away from importance. They train in the same fencing halls as the heirs, wear clothes stitched just shy of regal, and bear faces that resemble kings a little too closely to ignore. Tonight, you're watching one such child, illegitimate, unacknowledged, and utterly aware of it, walk silently past the throne room. He doesn't look left or right. He doesn't have to. He knows who he is, and more importantly, who he'll never be. Because here, in the gilded machinery of monarchy, the children of scandal are both invisible and indispensable. Officially, they don't exist. No lineage charts, no inheritance rights, no portraits in the grand halls. But off the record, everyone knows. The courtiers whisper, the servants see. The Queen's jaw tightens when she passes him in the corridor. The King's eyes flick toward him during ceremonies just for a second too long. It's not love. It's responsibility disguised as discomfort. Royal bastards, let's be blunt, were everywhere. Even in the most devout, morally upright courts, there were entire wings unofficially populated by the consequences of royal appetites. Some were spirited away immediately, shipped off to distant estates or quiet convents. Others were kept close, raised as wards, educated alongside nobles, groomed for military service, the clergy, or if they were especially well-favoured, the diplomatic corps. Places where they could be useful but never powerful. You slip into the palace's armoury, where a young man, call him Lucian, is practising with a sword. His instructor doesn't treat him like a prince, but he's not just another noble either. There's something in the way the others glance at him, deference, edged with discomfort. You overhear one boy murmur, "That's the king's mistake. It's meant to sting." Lucian doesn't react. He's heard it all before. Quirky historical footnote. Charles II of England, the so-called Merry Monarch, fathered at least a dozen acknowledged illegitimate children, each with different mistresses, many of whom were elevated to dukes and countesses. He openly adored them, even arranged good marriages for some. But when asked about making any of them his heir, he famously quipped, "I'm not such a fool as to make a bastard legitimate." The line was clear. A royal bastard could have everything but the throne. But what if the legitimate heir was fragile, unpopular, dead? Suddenly the bastard becomes not just visible but essential. You remember a story from the French court, an illegitimate son of a duke who bore a striking resemblance to the Dauphin. When the Dauphin fell ill, and whispers of his frailty grew louder, the illegitimate brother began appearing more often at court. He was charming, capable, politically moderate. For months the court began hedging bets. Some even said his elevation was being quietly negotiated. Then the Dauphin recovered. The bastard disappeared. Not dead, just reassigned to a colonial appointment, somewhere very far away. And yet some royal bastards thrived, not just surviving, but reshaping dynasties. Take the story of Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He was raised away from the court, given the name Geronimo, and brought up in relative obscurity. Then one day, as a teenager, he was summoned to court, told of his true parentage, renamed Don Juan, and placed in command of a fleet. A few years later, he led Christian forces to victory at the Battle of Lepanto. From ghost to hero. Or in Russia, rumours forever swirl around Catherine the Great's children. Her son, Paul, was officially fathered by her husband. Unofficially, most believe his father was her lover, Count Orloff, but no one dared say it out loud. The truth would destabilise everything, so the court played along, they always do. You pass through a quiet room filled with paintings, lesser-known nobles, minor courtiers, and a few children painted without names. Their eyes follow you, their faces familiar. You realise something eerie. These portraits were commissioned quietly, without public fanfare. by royals who couldn't bear to forget but also couldn't afford to remember out loud. One painting shows a young girl with auburn curls standing beside a harp. Her dress is finely made but lacks the royal embroidery. The plaque reads only, "Child of the Court, 1721. You remember hearing that she was the daughter of a visiting princess and a foreign ambassador. The pregnancy caused a scandal. The girl was sent to a convent at 12. The harp was destroyed. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these children ever posed a real threat to succession. Some say the fear was exaggerated, that a bastard child couldn't legally inherit and was therefore harmless. Others argue that in times of instability, any blood relative with ambition could become a rallying point for factions eager to reshape the monarchy. And some did. Pretenders, rebels, claimants to thrones, they often claim descent from forgotten or hidden bastards. Sometimes the claims were fake, sometimes disturbingly plausible. In times of war, bloodlines get blurry. You sit in a small reading room and flip through a memoir of a royal midwife, a woman who served 3 generations of queens. Tucked in the margins are notes, clearly added later. One reads, "The girl was delivered at dawn, no visitors allowed, taken by nursemaid to the old wing, never named, his orders." It chills you more than anything else you've read, not because of the secrecy, but because of the casual tone, like this was standard. And it was! You leave the archive and step into the night air. The stars above the palace shine indifferently. Somewhere inside, the king sleeps peacefully. His acknowledged children are tucked into beds warmed by politics. His unacknowledged ones? Scattered, watching, waiting. The palace prefers to pretend it is clean. That desire has no consequence. That power leaves no crumbs. But the truth is written on the faces of children raised to resemble no one, and everyone. Because a royal bastard is more than a secret. They are the proof. The scent of boiled herbs hits you as soon as you enter the royal infirmary. Thick, earthy, and tinged with something that smells suspiciously like scorched garlic. You gag, just slightly, and the old physician near the door waves a hand at you like he's shooing a bird. "It keeps the humours balanced," he grumbles, though from the look of the patient on the table, shirtless, sweating, and clearly in distress, it's not working. Welcome to the lesser-known nightmare of palace life. Royal sexual medicine, or more accurately, the centuries-long horror show of desperate attempts to fix what was never fully understood. You're here because the king hasn't been himself lately. He's irritable, pale, uninterested in his favourite mistress, and worst of all, he's not performing. That's how they phrase it. Not sick, not depressed, not burned out from having to father 4 heirs by 3 women in 5 years. Just not performing. Which means a parade of healers, quacks, monks, and old women with suspicious jars are trotting through the palace trying to restore his vigour. The current favourite remedy involves leeches. Of course it does. They're applied to the inner thighs, because obviously draining the blood near his groin is supposed to help. Somehow. If that doesn't work, there's a salve made from bear fat and cinnamon rubbed on the lower back. That's followed by a vapour bath, naked naturally, during which attendants chant prayers and fan him with scented palms. You can't make this up. Actually, they did. That's the problem. Medical science in royal courts was a chaotic blend of real anatomy, medieval guesswork, and astrology. And when it came to sexuality, libido, fertility, impotence, and everything in between, the cures were usually more dangerous than the disease. Take the royal fertility potions, a mix of anise, crushed pearls, and deer testicle powder, steeped in wine and served warm before bed. That was supposed to spark passion. In reality, it usually caused nausea and explosive diarrhea. But if the king managed to sleep with the queen anyway and she conceived, they'd say the potion worked. If she didn't, more potion. You flip through a medical ledger and find a note scrawled in the margins. Patient reports renewed appetite after mercury wash. You hope that's metaphorical. It's not. Mercury was widely used for cleansing the body of illness, including syphilis, which was both rampant and extremely taboo. Of course, mercury also causes nerve damage, mood swings, and eventually death. But hey, if your hair falls out and you start hallucinating angels, that just means it's working, and don't think the women were spared. If the queen failed to get pregnant quickly enough, she'd be subjected to an entirely different brand of torture. Steams, oils, intrusive examinations, and herbal compresses were all standard fare. One particularly horrifying treatment involved inserting a hot wax plug into the cervix and leaving it overnight to warm the womb. It did not work. It did, however, leave third-degree burns. That part worked very well. One quirky remedy comes from an old Austrian court record. A queen was instructed to wear a necklace strung with dried hummingbird hearts for sexual alignment. No one knew what that meant. She wore it for 4 months, still no baby. The hearts were eventually fed to the castle cat. You pass through a small apothecary where a woman in blue robes is crushing herbs with the intensity of someone who's seen too much. "This one's for stamina," she says, gesturing to a murky paste. "This one's for passion, and this one's for..." hiding the fact that neither of the first two worked. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. Some things are better treated with silence. Historians today debate how much of these medical interventions were true treatments versus elaborate forms of ritual control. Was the king really sick, or were the physicians just managing appearances? Was the queen really barren, or was her body just being used as a scapegoat for political disappointment? Often there was no way to tell, and even less motivation to ask. There's a case you read about once, a royal consort who complained of numbness and swelling in her legs. The physician bled her repeatedly, applied poultices, fed her herbs. Nothing worked. Eventually it was discovered, too late, that she was pregnant. The treatments had damaged the fetus. She miscarried. The king blamed her. She never bore another child. You move past a series of small cabinets marked with royal initials, personal blends. One is full of dried wolfberries, tiger balm and powdered egg yolk. Another contains a phallic-looking root carved into a literal phallus. It was a gift, apparently, from an ambassador, a gesture of goodwill. You wonder how many other gifts were part joke, part medicine, and fully ineffective. And then there's the superstition. A king might drink a tonic made from melted rubies because a soothsayer once claimed it hardened the will. Another might rub his chest with eagle fat while reciting psalms. A queen might sleep on a mattress filled with violets and crushed clove to entice the divine spark. When nothing worked, the palace turned to prayer, and when that failed, blame. Blame the mistress, blame the queen, blame the stars, blame the air. One of the oldest entries in the physician's log is simple and terrifying. The king fails, we shall pray. That's it. No cure, no attempt, just resignation. You step into the final room and find the king reclining with a damp cloth on his forehead. Expression flat, eyes distant. The healer beside him is muttering softly, applying some concoction to his temples. The king doesn't flinch. You wonder how much of this is actual illness, and how much is exhaustion from being turned into a breeding engine. Because that's the truth no one says out loud. Royal sexuality wasn't about pleasure, it was about function. And when that function faltered, the body was blamed, then punished, then rewritten. You leave the infirmary with the taste of bitterness in your mouth. Whether from the air or the truth, it's hard to say. Behind you, another concoction boils over. Another ritual begins. Because in the palace, a limp moment in bed can unravel dynasties, and they'll do anything, burn, bleed, swallow poison, to make sure it never happens again. The older wing of the palace doesn't get many visitors anymore. The halls are warped from moisture, the wood groaning under your step, and the once vibrant frescoes have faded into smudges of myth and memory. It's quieter here, the air heavier, not with dust, but with stories that never made it into the history books. This is where they housed them, the forgotten royal women. Not the queens, not the celebrated consorts. These were the ones whose names were erased, whose lovers were punished, and whose sexuality was rewritten as madness. You stop outside a narrow door. A rusted plaque reads, Lady E, 1749. No full name, just a letter. Inside is a modest chamber, bed, writing desk, wardrobe. The furniture is still here, untouched. So is the diary, still resting on the nightstand, as if she might return at any moment to continue writing. She won't. She was confined for 36 years, not for treason, not for murder, for desire. It was always the easiest diagnosis. A woman who wanted too much, who loved the wrong person, who refused a marriage proposal from a powerful man. Suddenly she was hysterical, unstable, dangerous, and in the world of royal courts, where every marriage was a political treaty and every child a chess piece, a woman's sexuality had to be contained. So if she refused to behave, the walls would close in. In the case of Lady E, the story goes that she was caught with a lower-ranked officer. There were letters, possibly drawings. One of the pages in her diary says, "He pressed his hand against my spine, and I didn't step away. I wanted the pressure. I wanted to feel owned." That sentence alone was enough for the court to declare her compromised. The king's advisors recommended swift action. She was relocated here, what they called a rest home. What it really was, a gilded cell. And she wasn't the only one. Royal women were often celebrated for their beauty, their grace, their ability to remain silent in the right moments. But the moment they pursued their own sexuality, without permission, without strategic purpose, they were seen as threats. Not just to the line of succession, but to the very image of royalty. You move down the hall past a mural depicting the virtues of the noble maiden: chastity, modesty, obedience. You wonder how many of the women who walked these halls tried to live up to that ideal. How many succeeded? How many gave up and paid the price? One chamber farther down belonged to a princess who fell in love with her female tutor. They were discovered after a letter was intercepted. The tutor was dismissed, publicly shamed, and later found drowned in the river. The princess? She was diagnosed with melancholia. Her treatments included ice baths, isolation, and forced readings from scripture. The records note she stopped speaking at age 20. No one wrote down when, or if, she started again. Quirky fact: the diagnosis of hysteria originated in ancient Greece, based on the belief that a woman's womb could wander throughout her body, causing madness. In royal courts, it became a catch-all explanation for any behaviour deemed inappropriate: sexual assertiveness, sadness, anger, laughter at the wrong time. Essentially, if you weren't behaving like a porcelain doll, you were suspect. By the 18th century, royal doctors were prescribing horrifying treatments. Genital massages by physicians, yes, seriously, to relieve tension. Pelvic restraints to keep women from stimulating themselves. Herbal sedatives strong enough to induce comas, all in the name of restoring order. And when the treatments failed, the narrative shifted. The woman was no longer troubled. She was officially mad, and once the label stuck, escape was impossible. There's a legend about one such woman, known only as the Blue Widow. She was married off at 16, widowed at 21, and reportedly entertained several lovers during her mourning period. Her freedom offended the court, so when a child turned up with her colouring, her wit, and a strong claim to illegitimate royal blood, the court turned on her. She was declared unfit, dangerous, a seductress corrupted by grief. She disappeared into this wing. Years later, when renovations were made, workers found her journal hidden inside the fireplace. The final page read, "I refused to fade, so they locked me away until I became the silence they wanted." Even today, historians argue whether these women were truly mentally ill or merely inconvenient. Some tried to defend the actions of the courts, claiming the standards were different, the science limited, the intentions pure. Others say those arguments sound too much like modern excuses, that calling a woman crazy has always been easier than calling out injustice. You reach the last room, it's still locked. No plaque, no name, just a metal handle and a faint scent of lavender. According to one of the attendants, this room once held a queen's cousin, sent away after being caught in bed with a married noblewoman. The queen allegedly begged for leniency. The king refused. The cousin vanished. You press your hand against the door. The wood is warm from the afternoon sun. On the other side is a space shaped by centuries of silence, and maybe it's not just the rooms. Maybe it's the palace itself that's designed to erase these women. The architecture prioritizes ceremony, not freedom. The corridors reward silence, not truth. And when a royal woman dares to claim her own pleasure, her own body, her own voice, It's treated as a glitch in the system. You step back into the main corridor, blinking at the brightness of the chandelier. Servants move past you, speaking in low tones. Music plays faintly from the ballroom. The world spins on, as if none of these women ever existed, but they did. They desired, they defied, and they paid. Because in this palace, a man's affair is a pastime, but a woman's desire, that's madness. You wake before dawn and the palace feels different. Not quieter. There's always a servant somewhere scrubbing marble or adjusting flowers, but sharper. Like something shifted behind the curtains. The air tastes like tension. You dress quickly and move toward the eastern wing, where the private councils meet, and where, more urgently, you've heard a wedding is being arranged. But not for love, never for love. This is the kind of match sewn together not with roses, but with ledgers and war maps. You've finally arrived at the heart of the matter. How sex, marriage, and alliances form the real machinery of empire. The bride, they say, is 14. She's beautiful in the way queens are supposed to be. Porcelain skin, wide eyes, and a talent for staying silent in a room full of men. She's the niece of a rival king, which makes her body valuable territory. Her virginity, a form of leverage. Her future womb, a ticking clock set to dynasty. This match has nothing to do with attraction. It's a ceasefire with embroidery. You slip into the gallery above the council chamber where the marriage contract is being negotiated. It's less a discussion, more a barter. Dowry size, number of ships, land rights, future heirs. The girl is not present. Of course she's not. She's being fitted for a dress in another wing, half drugged with calming tea, her mother whispering that this is how queens are made. She's not crying, which means she's been raised well. This isn't unique, it's centuries of tradition. In medieval Europe, royal marriages were almost always tools of foreign policy. Lust came second, if it came at all. Marriage was a treaty, and sex was the signature that made it legally binding. One particularly blunt example, the Habsburg dynasty. For generations, they maintained power not by conquering with swords, but by marrying anyone with a title, a heartbeat, and some vaguely related blood. The family motto may as well have been, "We breed to rule." Cousins married cousins. Nieces married uncles. It was less family tree and more tangled wreath. The cost? Genetic disaster. But politically? It worked. You've read letters from queens who begged not to be sent away. Teenage girls marrying older kings they'd never met, in countries where they didn't speak the language. One Austrian archduchess wrote, "They say he is 63, I am 16. But if I am quiet and bear sons, they will call me successful." You walk past the royal tailor's quarters where the wedding gown is being stitched. Hundreds of pearls, a veil long enough to trip a horse, symbolism over comfort. The gown isn't for her, it's for the court, for the portraits, for the history books. Proof of purity, proof of purpose. You pause at the royal chapel where the marriage will take place. There's a special platform built for the bedding ceremony. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. After the vows, the bride and groom will be escorted to the bedchamber, stripped by attendants and laid together under witness. Not always literally observed, sometimes symbolic, sometimes not. Either way, the point is clear. This union is not just private, it's public property. Quirky historical moment. In 1469, the marriage between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon was accompanied by a formal bedding ceremony, where the crowd waited outside the chamber door and cheered when proof of consummation, a bloodied sheet, was held up. Applause for a teenage girl's trauma. Romantic, right? Back in the hall, the king's advisors are smiling. The bride's dowry includes a port town they've wanted for years. Everyone wins, except the girl. But let's not pretend all royal marriage beds were cold. Sometimes the pair actually liked each other. Sometimes passion surprised them. But more often, the flame that lit the political candle burned out fast. Affairs began, separate bedrooms were established, and the political machine rolled on, as long as children were produced. You remember reading about one queen who, after 20 years of royal duty and 5 children, took a lover in her 40s, a young poet. It was quiet, discreet, but when discovered, she was exiled. The king, who had 12 acknowledged mistresses, acted outraged. The council called her reckless. She wrote in a letter, "They used my body to plant the seed of empire, but I may not bloom in my own garden." You reach the room where the bride is being prepared. She's standing still while 3 women fuss over her hair. She glances at you for half a second, just long enough for you to catch the flash of something beneath the politeness. Not fear, not even sadness. Resignation. This is her duty. She's been raised for it. Her mother did it. Her grandmother too. It's generational survival. Give your body to the cause. Smile. Conceive. Die quietly, or retire with jewels and no power. There's scholarly debate, of course, about whether these marriages worked. Politically, yes, sometimes for decades. Personally, rarely. But that wasn't the goal. Happiness didn't matter. Lust didn't matter. What mattered was the appearance of stability. An heir. A future. As you leave the wing, you overhear 2 noblewomen whispering. One says, "At least he's not ugly." The other replies, "He'll be gone by spring, at war, or in someone else's bed. She'll be queen either way." That's the real logic. Endure the wedding. Survive the bedding. Outlive the husband if you can. Then rule. You step back out into the courtyard where the flower garlands are being strung. The palace will celebrate tonight. The guests will dance. Toasts will be made. No one will mention that the bride's hands shook while signing the contract, that the groom asked for a different mistress to warm his bed the night before, because the marriage wasn't made for them, it was made for power. And in the palace, nothing, not even love, is above that. There's a particular time of night in the palace, long after the last candle has been snuffed in the chapel, and just before the kitchens begin clattering for the dawn meal, when the walls feel alive. Not haunted exactly, but alert, like they're listening. That's when the palace's other network stirs to life. Not the ministers, not the clergy, but the spies. Not the kind with daggers and disguises, but something far more dangerous. People who watch what happens in the dark and know exactly what to do with that knowledge. Because when sex happens behind silk curtains in a place built on power, you can bet someone is keeping notes. You find yourself in the laundry chamber, far less glamorous than the grand halls, but arguably more important. This is where linens are washed, dried, and examined. Because in the palace, a soiled sheet isn't just dirty, it's evidence of fidelity, of fertility, of betrayal. And if someone knows how to read the stains, they can write the story before the lovers even leave the room. You watch as 2 maids lift a silk sheet, squinting at a faint smudge. One shrugs, the other smirks. "Well," she says, "looks like the ambassador's wife enjoyed her night." The first maid rolls her eyes. Pity her husband's still at sea. The comment hangs there for a moment before they go back to scrubbing. These women know everything. They handle the queen's underthings, the king's bedrobes, the chamber pots of visiting dukes. They know who's sharing beds, who isn't, and who's faking it. They're invisible to the nobles, which makes them unstoppable. The court likes to think it's in control of the narrative, but the truth lives in the whispers of servants. There's a whole economy of gossip here, traded in careful glances and folded notes. A chambermaid sees a foreign princess leaving the wrong room at the wrong hour. She tells the steward, who tells the court musician, who tells the mistress of the queen's wardrobe, who just so happens to be sleeping with one of the king's advisors. That's how a rumour becomes policy. Quirky historical tidbit. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs were often the most powerful informants in the palace. Guarding the harem, they were trusted with access no one else had, and many rose to positions of enormous political influence. They knew who was favoured, who was pregnant, who was plotting, which made them priceless and dangerous. Here in this palace, the structure is subtler. No official titles, just networks. The valet who laces the prince's boots and hears him mutter in his sleep. The lady's maid who finds notes folded into corsets. The cook who delivers warm milk laced with herbs, quietly, night after night, to the same unnamed room. One such cook passes by you now, carrying a tray of figs and cinnamon tea. You follow her at a distance, watching her disappear behind a hidden door built into the stone. You wait. 5 minutes. 10. She returns alone. Silent. You say nothing, and neither does she. Later you speak to one of the king's scribes. Thin, twitchy, too pale for someone who supposedly spends his days in the sunlit scriptorium. He mentions casually, "The Dowager Countess has requested a second bath each night for the past 2 weeks." You raise a brow. He smiles. Her arthritis didn't get worse. Her steward's son got taller. He winks. It's revolting, but it's useful. Because in the palace, information is currency, and sexual secrets are gold. Some use it to blackmail. A scorned lover writes down every name and every night, storing it all in a locked box. One wrong move from the court, and suddenly a list of affairs appears in the hands of a rival ambassador. Others use it as leverage. A maid approaches a noblewoman. "I know about your visitor last Tuesday. Help me get my sister into your service, and I'll keep your midnight adventures between us." You read a note slipped under your door. No signature, just 3 lines. The prince doesn't sleep in his chambers. The queen still keeps her locket. The third daughter is no longer bleeding. That last line says more than pages of reports. You burn the note. The question scholars always debate: how much of royal history was shaped not by public acts, but private ones turned into weapons? Was a war started because a king was insulted at court, or because a rival sent proof that his queen had strayed? Did an alliance fall apart because of conflicting ideologies, or because someone whispered the wrong name into the wrong ear at just the wrong moment? One story, half lost to time, half preserved in a merchant's journal, tells of a duchess who, after years of being overlooked, uncovered a secret affair between her husband and a foreign princess. Rather than confront him, she leaked the letters to the opposing court, derailed the alliance, and positioned her own nephew to marry the princess instead. No violence, no speeches, just sex, strategically exposed. The palace pretends these things are accidents, outliers, rare. But when you see how many doors have been built with second exits, how many corridors end in blind corners, how many guards are posted not near treasure but near bedrooms, you begin to understand. They've been planning for this all along. You step out into the courtyard where the first light of morning touches the stone. The laundry has been hung, the sheets are clean, but you know better. Nothing here is clean. Everything is folded with intent. Every garment tells a story. Every scent clinging to fabric is a footnote in someone else's scandal. Because in the palace, sex isn't just behind closed doors. It's carried, watched, traded, and weaponized. The sun is high now, casting long rectangles of light through the tall windows of the Royal Portrait Gallery. Each frame is massive, each subject regal, perfectly posed, chins tilted, eyes full of ambition or studied detachment. But you're not looking at the faces, you're looking at the hands, at the folds of fabric, at what they're choosing to show and what's been strategically left out. Because nothing in these portraits is an accident. In fact, some of the most explosive scandals in palace history were scrubbed clean not by censors or fire, but by paint. Sex, edited with brush strokes. You stop in front of a massive oil painting of a queen in a pearl-studded gown, her fingers gently brushing a rose. She's serene, motherly, untouchable. But you've read the letters, her letters, where she writes about a secret rendezvous in the palace garden. The feel of someone else's ringed hand beneath her skirts. "He kissed me like he was drowning," she wrote. But here, in this portrait, there's no trace of that woman, just the mask, the symbol. This entire wing is an illusion, built to preserve the image of control. Monarchs immortalized not as people, but as ideals. Strength, purity, fertility, power. The sex lives of these rulers are painted out, or worse, symbolically buried. A dog for loyalty, a swan for grace, a fig for discretion. The symbolism piles up like perfume over sweat. In some cases, you can literally see the edits. A duke with a hand once resting on a courtesan's shoulder now clutches a scroll. A princess with a telltale curve of belly now painted slightly slimmer, because the child was born too soon and died too fast. One particularly bold portrait once depicted a king with his favourite mistress beside him, seated just lower, smiling. Years later, after their relationship collapsed publicly, she was painted over, vanished into the shadows. You pass by a smaller portrait, almost hidden, of a young nobleman once celebrated for his wit and beauty. He was rumoured to be the king's favourite, though officially they were just close companions. When he was exiled, the painting was moved here to this quiet corner. You lean in. A faint outline remains where the king's hand once rested on his shoulder, painted out, but not completely. The restoration was rushed. The canvas remembers. Quirky fact. In the 1600s, artists were often given whispered instructions to enhance virtue. That was the code. If a noblewoman was known to have taken lovers, her neckline would be raised in the painting. If a man was involved in a scandal, his likeness might be adjusted, made thinner, sterner, more pious looking. One particularly skilled painter even specialised in moral corrections. He made a fortune repainting expressions after betrayals. Of course, some rulers leaned into the myth-making themselves. They commissioned portraits to rewrite their stories. One empress, long rumoured to have seduced her way to the throne, hired an artist to depict her surrounded by books and scrolls, a globe at her side, her hands folded neatly in her lap. That image became the one remembered in textbooks. The lovers, forgotten, or at least politely ignored. You step into a room labelled Private Portraiture, Restricted Collection. It's not on the usual palace tour. Inside, the walls are lined with canvases that never made it to the main halls. These are the ones too scandalous, too personal, too truthful. A prince reclining on a couch, shirtless, eyes heavy-lidded. A duchess with her bodice slipping off one shoulder, fingers delicately holding a wine glass, and another hand, not hers, resting on her thigh. These weren't meant for public display, they were gifts, confessions, proof. One painting is of a queen, not young, not smiling, but radiant in her age. She stands beside another woman, a servant by the looks of her clothes. They're touching, not scandalously, but tenderly, a hand on a wrist, the kind of contact that's impossible to fake. You can feel the intimacy through the canvas. On the back is a single line, "Let them guess. You knew." The debate among modern historians is whether these pieces should be considered art or evidence. Some argue that portraiture was a form of self-curation, no different from royal proclamations or political marriages. Others believe these paintings, especially the hidden ones, tell the real stories, moments when rulers dropped the mask, if only for an afternoon in a studio, and let themselves be seen. But even that is a kind of manipulation, because what's more powerful than being seen exactly how you want to be? That's what royalty always understood. Sex could be indulged, whispered about, even abused, but it could never be allowed to disrupt the image. The crown must remain untarnished, even if the sheets were soaked in compromise. You pause before one final painting covered in a dusty cloth. Something about the way it's tucked away, almost ashamed, makes you curious. You lift the edge and find a half-finished portrait. A royal woman, eyes closed, lips parted, nothing regal about her at all. She looks human, vulnerable, in love, maybe, or lost. There's no signature, no date, just a sliver of rawness that feels out of place in this hall of performance. You let the cloth fall. The gallery is silent again. The painted faces stare down at you, polished and frozen, their secrets blurred into myth. You wonder how many of them died misunderstood. How many were remembered for virtues they never chose and sins they never got to enjoy. And how many were painted as saints, while their lovers disappeared without so much as a sketch. Because in this palace, art doesn't imitate life, it erases it. One brushstroke at a time, night again, final night. The palace is quiet but not peaceful, more like that moment before a storm, when everything is holding its breath. You've wandered every wing now, from the rose-trellised gardens where queens once whispered about impossible loves to the basements, where footmen pass secrets like currency. And still, there's one door left, one you've avoided until now. A heavy iron slab tucked behind the chapel, engraved only with a crown and a serpent. You know what it is, everyone does, even if they never talk about it. This is the vault, not for gold, not for jewels, for something far more dangerous. The records. They call it the Black Archive, and it holds everything the palace couldn't burn. You descend the narrow staircase, the stone slick with centuries of footsteps. At the bottom, a gate. Beyond it, shelves. Thousands of them, scrolls, ledgers, letters, testimonies, confessions, every scandal too sensitive to destroy, every affair too risky to ignore. It's all here, locked away not to protect the people from the truth, but to protect the monarchy from the people. The first document you open is crisp, deliberate. A confession from a royal mistress written under pressure. Yes, I knew he was married. I was told it pleased God for him to take comfort with me. They gave me a medallion for my silence. At the bottom, a royal seal. She was 18. You keep reading. A steward's log, noting the movements of a crown prince. Entered Lady V's chamber at 11:34. Exited at 2:17. No mention made to His Majesty. A private journal from a bishop questioning his own role in a forced marriage. I performed the ceremony. I watched her weep. I told myself it was for the good of the realm. The Black Archive doesn't hide crimes. It catalogues them, coldly, neatly, as if sex, betrayal and manipulation were simply forms to be filed. There's a file labelled Heirs Under Question. Inside, dozens of cases, some you've heard whispered about, others completely buried. One tells of a child born with features too similar to a certain chamberlain. The Queen insisted it was divine coincidence. The chamberlain was reassigned to the colonies. The child became king. Quirky detail. One folder is labelled Murmurs. It contains only rumours, collected, dated, tracked. A mistress seen entering through the chapel door. A prince caught weeping in his valet's arms. A sudden order of tonics known for inducing miscarriage. No proof, but in the palace, enough rumour strung together becomes truth in waiting. One especially chilling section contains forged love letters, created by palace scribes to frame an unwanted consort, justify her removal, and cover the king's boredom. The letters are beautiful, heart-wrenching, and fake. You feel sick. Because this isn't just a vault of secrets, it's a tool, a mechanism for control, for rewriting, for reminding everyone who wields power here. Even now, some of the names in these files walk the palace halls. They smile at banquets. They speak of duty. But their pasts are preserved in ink just to draw away. And here's the darkest twist. Some of them keep coming down here, not to hide their secrets, but to edit them. There are gaps in some records, pages carefully removed, redacted with knife and ash. Others have notes added years later, changing the narrative, making monsters into martyrs, turning consent into conspiracy. You wonder who made those changes, and what they were trying to forget. There's a historian's debate about this place. Some say it was created to ensure transparency in case of collapse. Others believe it's a blackmail engine, maintained by the crown to keep its own people in line. The truth is likely both. A dynasty's sins filed and organised in case the future demands a bargain. You close the last folder and sit in the silence. The walls seem to press in now, not with menace, but with weight. As if the centuries of secrets are leaning on your shoulders, whispering, this is the real history. This is what the portraits don't say. This is what the marble halls will never confess. And you realise this entire palace, for all its beauty, for all its ceremony, is held together by a network of shame and desire. It doesn't fall because it hides these things. It thrives because it manages them. Sex isn't the crack in the system. It is the system, controlled, weaponized, curated. You climb the stairs slowly, the air thick with dust and secrets. Outside, the palace begins to stir. Servants light fires. Courtiers stretch and yawn. Soon there will be trumpets and schedules and speeches about honour. But you know better now. Behind every title is a story rewritten. Behind every marriage, a list of sacrifices. Behind every heir, a question someone was paid not to ask. You walk through the gates one last time, turning back to glance at the palace, the golden facade, the pristine windows, the fluttering flags. A fantasy built on desire. A kingdom ruled not just by power, but by the things no one dares speak out loud. But you've heard them all, and you'll never unhear them. So here you are, back in your own bed, staring at the ceiling. Hopefully not under embroidered velvet or between sheets someone's going to examine tomorrow morning, but safe, quiet, alone. You've just walked through 30 sections of royal palaces and uncovered what they desperately tried to hide for centuries. Lust in silk gloves, secrets under crowns, passion behind locked doors, and maybe, just maybe, you're starting to understand that the throne, for all its glory, was never a seat of purity. It was a spotlight, and everyone in its glow was playing a part. You've seen it all now, haven't you? The public bedding rituals, the midnight dalliances behind tapestries, the aphrodisiacs, the political marriages, the threats disguised as love letters, the quiet rebellion of those who just said, "No, actually, I want something else." You've watched bastards become legends, queens become scapegoats, and lovers become ghosts. You've stood in the halls where pleasure was dangerous and denial was currency. And through it all you've followed a single truth. Royal sex wasn't about desire. It was about power. It shaped treaties. It caused wars. It produced heirs and bastards, myths and scandals, portraits and lies. It could crown a mistress and exile a queen. It could inspire poetry or send someone to a dungeon. And the most haunting part? So much of it never made it to the records. What you've seen, what you now know, was hidden for a reason. Maybe it's a little disillusioning. Maybe you'll never look at a crown the same way again. Good. You weren't supposed to. History has always been taught from the balcony. Big speeches, big names, clean versions. But tonight, you climbed down the marble staircase and crept through the servants' halls, eavesdropped through the keyholes and found the real story whispered in linen closets and written in vanished diaries. And now that the lights are dim and the final curtain's been drawn, all that's left is silence, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth. Sleep easy, you've earned it.